I grew up in Australia, in a fairly rural area, on a cow farm. My favourite memories of being on the farm was spending time with my father on Saturday mornings. I had two younger brothers who were both asthmatics, so they didn't spend time out on the farm, which made spending time with my dad more special to me. That was the only one-on-one time that I got to spend with him.
Andrew Facey, Brooklyn's father, is a wealthy fourth-generation real estate developer in Melbourne.
When I was a kid, I thought my dad was a superhero. He took over his father's real estate business when he was 18 years old, and he expanded the business very significantly.
Brooklyn's mother is a beautiful socialite.
I had a very difficult relationship with my mother. There was the expectation that I was going to be as thin and as beautiful as what she was. And it didn't seem to matter what I did. It was never good enough for her. And it's caused a significant amount of trauma in my life.
Brooklyn wants to follow in her father's footsteps one day, but here too, she meets with rejection.
My intention was to take over the family business, but my father is somewhat old school in that he likes to keep the men in the business and the women at home.
Her dad does agree to support her financially, and Brooklyn sets her sights on college. But then, disaster strikes.
When I was 18 years old, I had a head-on collision with a truck. I had a closed head injury, my face and jaw was smashed, and I have since had 54 orthopedic surgeries to rebuild my body. I spent most of the year either in a wheelchair or on crutches, but I managed to get through that year at college.
Brooklyn eventually finishes her degree, but rethinks her future.
I couldn't spend time standing and on my feet all day, which is what's required if you're in real estate. One of the things that interested me was esthetician. So I did a course in that, and then I opened my own business in a gym in Melbourne. I met my first husband at the gym after one of the surgeries. After my car accident, I felt like I had been smashed into pieces, and I felt that nobody was going to want me. So as soon as somebody did come along that appeared interested in me, I feel like I kind of latched on to that.
The couple marry in 1996 when Brooklyn is 27, and she gives birth to her first son a year later.
By the time I was pregnant with my second son, I was working and I had a toddler, and my patience with my husband was really just running low. I said to him, "You're going to have to go because you're not pulling your weight."
After 5 years of marriage, Brooklyn takes full custody of her sons with minimal resistance from her ex. A year later, she's ready to dip her toes back into the dating pool.
For anyone who's been a single mother, it's an exhausting gig. And I hoped that I would find someone who would come in and be a part of the family and contribute to that. So I signed up for an Australian dating online service.
She met Paul Carter on RSVP, the online dating site. He came across to her as very available. He was single, unmarried, without children, and looking for love.
So the next night I went on my first date with Paul Carter. And that was a date with destiny, to say the least. Paul showed up in a bright yellow sports car, and that epitomized Paul's personality. He was flashy, he was showy. We went out for dinner and we laughed and talked and got on great, and he was just very easy to talk to, and we just kind of clicked. He has a big personality and he is an amusing person to spend time with.
Paul is ambitious and has his sights set on a bright financial future as a real estate developer and independent business owner.
I needed a man that was going to step up, somebody that had the sort of alpha male qualities that my dad had. That's how Paul came across initially. We got romantically involved pretty quickly from that point. I had come from being married to somebody who was really not physically interested in me at all. And he was this guy, he was very sexual and a great lover. And I appealed to him. That made me feel great.
Eventually, Brooklyn introduces her sons to Paul.
My middle son was about 18 months old and my eldest son was about 4. And he got along great with them and he was happy to play with them and spend time with them, and so they thought he was great.
For 6 months, the four are spending all of their weekend time together. Eventually, work intervenes and Paul says he has to focus on some business matters.
He says that he can't see me this weekend. Okay, that's fine, no problem. I thought it was because he was trying to get stuff done. I ended up going to the South Melbourne market and I'm wandering around the market and I look up and here's Paul walking towards me hand in hand with a girl that I had no idea who she was. And he couldn't get her to let go of his hand fast enough. And I said to him, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "Oh, I'm just showing so-and-so around Melbourne. She's here visiting from Canada." And I couldn't even think at that point. Like, I couldn't think of anything to say. I was left standing there like an idiot, in shock. And when I finally got to ask him about it, his explanation was, "Oh, I was holding her hand because she was scared." She was scared. He claims that she just showed up unannounced. Nobody flies from Canada to Australia on a whim. I'm not somebody that strings people out or plays games, so I wasn't at that time familiar with being played the way that he was playing me. I started to get suspicious. I couldn't understand why I was never invited to his place. So one day when he was in the shower, I pulled his driver's license from his wallet and got his address. His name on his driver's license was Paul Carter, but the address didn't really fit with the narrative that he was putting up about being this super successful guy and having all these designer brands and this flashy car. And I thought, okay, well, I'll go pay a visit and see what's going on at this house. I pull up to the house and I knocked on the door, and this older man, Paul's dad, answered the door. And I said, "Is Paul Carter here?" And he said, "Do you mean Paul Cristallo?" And I said, "No, Paul Carter. This is his address." He said, "Well, Paul Cristallo lives here with his wife, Sonia, and he has 3 kids from his previous marriage." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was surreal. I have 2 little boys who are becoming quite attached to him. And there was a sideboard just inside the door and it had all these photos from their wedding, the pictures of the kids, pictures of his wife. And I felt like the ground was going to open up and swallow me.
Brooklyn Facey is reeling from the news that her new boyfriend, Paul Carter, is not the successful single man he claims to be. In fact, he's married with kids.
This was his second marriage that he was in. At that point, the first marriage, he had 3 kids. And he has a different last name. At this point, I'm starting to wonder if anything about him is real.
Brooklyn decides to confront Paul, who simply shrugs it off.
He says, Yes, I'm married, but we're separated and we're just living in the house together. It didn't sound unrealistic. I thought, this guy's got a lot of potential. He was an exciting person. He's not boring like my last husband was. In hindsight, I should have just stuck with boring.
After the painful confrontation, Paul divorces his second wife and moves into an apartment. And soon, the deception is in the rear view as he plays dad to a blended family with Brooklyn.
He had 3 young children. I had 2 young children. Their ages sort of meshed together. Every other weekend, we had all 5 of them. I loved having the kids there. It was a lot of work for sure, but my boys were happy to have playmates. Thought Paul was pretty good with helping with things around the house, and he was involved in everything that they were doing. So we had a pretty good team situation going on. It meant a great deal to me because I was looking for a partner.
In March 2003, 8 months after first meeting Paul, he surprises Brooklyn with a grand gesture.
Paul proposed to me at the beach. He got down on one knee and asked me to marry him. I was thrilled. I was so excited. He convinced me that the life that we were going to have together was going to be wonderful. I didn't really get a sense that my parents didn't like him until I said to them that we were getting married, and they were not in favour of the idea. Right from the get-go, my father thought Paul was sketchy and he couldn't put his finger on it. But, you know, I was an adult. I was in my 30s by that stage, and I was going to do what I was going to do. So we got married on St Kilda Beach in Melbourne. My father came to the wedding. My mother did not come to the wedding. We had all the kids there, all dressed up in black pants and white shirts, and it was so beautiful. And everything seemed so perfect that day. I finally felt like I had the family that I had not had for my whole life. And I was the mother in the family, and I was never going to let my kids feel lonely or sad or unloved. Just thought that was the beginning of the happily ever after. So after we got married, the first couple of years were kind of rough. I was dealing with chronic pain from my car accident, but I felt like Paul had my back. I felt like he was there for me. For the most part, he seemed to be on my team.
The couple doesn't have to worry about money. Brooklyn may be cut out of running the family business, but her dad is still supportive. They move into a bigger house, and when she starts feeling healthier, they take another big step.
We decided to have a child together, and we had Mac, who is the love of my life, and he is my heart and soul.
After Mac's birth, Brooklyn and Paul buy an outdoor equipment company to run as a family business.
I was hoping that it would be something that we could work together in, and then there would be like a legacy for our kids. I was working there part-time, and I was doing the books, and Paul was selling the items, and he was very creative with his marketing, and he would start selling things on eBay. My dad injected a very significant amount of money so we could try and, make a go of it. He was trying to protect me financially, and he wanted to help Paul create something that was going to be good for us.
But after 18 months, they don't have enough cash flow to replenish their stock.
Paul was spending more money than he was bringing in. It wasn't until he was working for something that I was involved in that I got a glimpse of his poor business practices. And my dad basically bailed us out of it. So once we lost the company, my dad then had that over me. And I was going to hear about that forever and a day, that he had saved me and that otherwise we would have been bankrupt. Paul really did a good job of putting a wedge between us.
In 2010, Paul was appointed the CEO of United Housing Victoria, which is a publicly funded community housing company, and there he ran big sort of multi-million-dollar construction jobs.
The organization provides housing for low-income families.
He manages to pull this great job with United Housing, a very secure job, paying very well, and I'm thinking, great, everything's back on track now. I had no idea that he was doing anything wrong at the time.
He was let go after 2 years because they saw they were just hemorrhaging money. The suspicion was that Paul was blowing out the contracts of these construction jobs and pocketing that money.
Brooklyn and Paul have huge mortgage payments for the house they own together, and their debts are mounting because of Paul's excessive spending.
I was panic-stricken, and Paul's way of placating me was to say, I'll just pick up extra jobs on the side. We were in a bad place in our marriage. We ended up having to sell the house. My dad was furious. He was telling me that Paul doesn't know what he's doing. I was humiliated, totally humiliated. The fact that Paul was so irresponsible with money was another reason that my dad felt that he was not a good influence on the boys and that they would be better off with their biological father. He was putting pressure on my ex-husband. My father said to him, I will pay for your lawyers and I will put the kids through school. They took me to court and they filed for custody of my sons.
The custody battle continues for 3 years.
I had run out of money for lawyers. I had no chance of winning. No chance.
Finally, in 2013, Brooklyn loses custody of her 2 oldest sons, who are now 12 and 15. Perhaps influenced by their grandfather, they choose to side with their father.
So my ex-husband, he allowed my father to do this, and he really hasn't worked a day since then. There's only one thing that I really take pride in, and that is that I think I'm a good mum. And for me to lose my kids like that was just so devastating. If it wasn't for Mac, it would have been the end of me.
But for Brooklyn, these losses are just the beginning. Brooklyn Carter is staggering from the heartbreaking loss of her custody battle.
My family, I have no connection with because they've all taken my dad's side. I've lost 2 of my sons, so all I have left is my youngest son and my husband. It would have been easier for me if I had died that day. Everything that I had tried to keep safe and everything that mattered to me had just been handed over to someone else. And I just hope that when my boys are older, they realize that I never, ever stopped loving them. For a long time, I was so focused on the court battle with my kids that I was not paying attention to my husband. He felt that he was missing out on time and energy that I should have been putting into him. He was going to motocross meetings and joining motocross clubs. He was buying cars and changing cars frequently.
Paul would use Brooklyn to subsidise his lifestyle, things like fast cars, properties, credit cards.
There was constant stress in the house. Bills needed to be paid.
Brooklyn has managed to protect a portion of her nest egg from Paul's spending, but she's concerned he might eventually drain all of her money.
I really didn't have a lot of options other than to take back control myself. And my version of that was to take my money and put it somewhere else where Paul couldn't touch it, and I knew it would be safe. So we got an E2 treaty visa, which is granted to Australians who invest into a business in the United States. We had been to Boston to visit, and I loved it there. So I bought a couple of houses and rented them out.
Coincidentally, just as Brooklyn ties up her finances with offshore real estate and her money is out of his reach, Paul comes into a windfall.
On my son Mac's 5th birthday, we were having a party at our house for him, and Paul announced to me that he had inherited a large plot of land from his grandmother, and the government were trying to buy that land because they wanted to put a highway through.
Paul explains that this land is in Italy, and the sale is slightly delayed by red tape.
He showed me some documentation, and it all looked very bona fide to me, which was incredibly exciting because he was telling me that it was worth tens of millions of dollars. And that's one of the things about Paul. He always bounces back, often bigger and better than he was before.
Brooklyn feels hope for the first time since losing custody of her oldest sons. But she's worried how their absence is affecting Mac, her youngest.
It was very difficult for my youngest son to come home every night and not have his brothers there and go to the same school and not see his brothers.
Brooklyn suggests to Paul that they move to Boston.
By this stage, he was working for himself as a builder, and he had various projects underway. He said, okay, great, we'll buy houses, renovate them and flip them and start a new life.
Brooklyn and Mac head to Boston in April of 2014.
I was still devastated about my sons, but it was easier to try and move forward when I wasn't faced with the same things every day that reminded me of them. So Mac and I are in Boston. He was happy, I was happy, and we were expecting that Paul would join us within 2, maybe 3 months. Then suddenly the communication starts to dwindle and he's not calling every day. He didn't contact me for my birthday. It didn't take long for me to question him about what was going on. So he says to me, I would finish these jobs a lot quicker if you can fund them, and then once I finish them, I'll get the final payment and then I'll repay you.
Brooklyn knows that lending money to Paul is a risk, but after 11 years of marriage, she doesn't want to give up on him.
I don't like quitters, and I don't like to quit on things myself. I'm going to stick with something until the very end. So I went ahead and gave him the money.
It won't be long before Brooklyn discovers the real purpose of the money.
It was the middle of the night, and I was woken up by Mac, who was then 8 years old, who had his iPad in his hand. So he hands me his iPad and says, "Who is this lady in the picture with Dad?" Somebody had sent him a Facebook notification. Hang on, is this an old picture of Paul? This is my husband, but I've got no idea who this woman is. Paul's wearing a black tie suit, and this blonde woman is wearing what looks like a ball gown. I had no idea when the photo was taken, who this woman was, what Paul was doing there, or what the event was. I felt sick. I felt like my whole life was spinning out of control.
Brooklyn Carter is mortified to discover pictures of her husband in the very close company of another woman.
I'm realizing that this is not an old photo from some time before my time with Paul. This is something that's going on now that shouldn't be going on.
It doesn't take long to figure out that the event is an engagement party, and the lady in red is Paul's new fiancée.
Catherine Dubois was a Melbourne woman. She was a bit of a socialite, had great friends, but love was missing, and so she went online to find that. Catherine met Paul on Tinder. Paul rocked up to that date driving a Maserati and claimed he owned a big fleet of them. He claimed to be a self-made millionaire with this big property empire across Melbourne and Queensland.
The courtship begins after Brooklyn leaves for Boston.
Catherine said it was something of a whirlwind romance. He was extremely kind, he paid a lot of attention to her, and came across as extremely committed. She decided to move in with him, and to her shock, he lived in this basic townhouse in Box Hill, which is certainly not where you'd think a multimillionaire lives. Paul had an explanation, and that was that this was a temporary place that he was living while he and his ex-partner had been building this dream home. He actually told her his ex-wife had passed away with brain cancer, so she stopped asking questions. It was about 12 weeks into their love story. Paul got down on one knee and asked Catherine to marry him, and it was an easy yes for her. Catherine owned a beauty bar just outside of Melbourne, and it was to be acquired by the government to make way for a major road project. Catherine said that Paul really convinced her that he was something of an acquisitions expert, and so she was quick to transfer him power of attorney.
With Brooklyn conveniently tucked away in Boston, Paul Carter feels confident that he's safe to openly celebrate his new love. But he fails to consider the massive reach of social media.
After several months of me questioning whether he was having an affair or he was becoming more and more distant, I finally had the proof. So I called him and I said to him, "What the hell is this? What is going on?" He said that he would come over to Boston, and in the meantime we were doing counselling over the phone and trying to figure out if this was at all salvageable.
In Australia, Catherine Dubois receives a very similar shock.
After Catherine and Paul's engagement party, she receives a call from somebody who knows Paul. And they tell her, he has a wife and child in the US. You need to end this. Catherine now believes that he was trying to take over the beauty salon that she'd transferred into his name.
Paul and Catherine break off their relationship, and in November 2014, Paul heads off to Boston and attempts to patch up his relationship with Brooklyn.
He was able to convince me that he was remorseful for what he had done. I'd already been through a divorce and lost my kids. I wasn't going to risk doing that again and losing my youngest son. So I was going to do whatever I had to do to make it work. I still felt like I could pull out the defibrillator once again and restart the heart and try and get things back on track.
On a romantic trip to New York City for Brooklyn's 46th birthday, Paul tells her he wants to renew his commitment to her.
We had a lovely weekend in New York City, and he had organised with a jeweller to look at some diamonds because he was going to get a ring made for me.
But within weeks, it becomes clear she'll never get that diamond ring.
The money hasn't been transferred to the jeweller. No money has come into our accounts. I had faced about as much humiliation as I could take at this point. I was really losing faith in Paul. But I want to be able to say to my kids that I gave it my best shot. I didn't just quit because it got too hard. I just wasn't prepared to lose all that money and then find out a couple of weeks later that he inherited tens of millions of dollars from his grandmother.
Paul has one more gambit to keep Brooklyn happy.
Early 2018, we took over a lease on a horse farm that we were to purchase. We had scheduled the closing to coincide with plenty of time for the money to come from overseas.
Paul spent many years convincing Brooklyn that he was to inherit, and every time this deal was due to close, there was always an excuse as to why it wasn't happening. He would go to extreme lengths to keep up the con. fake contracts written in Italian would be delivered to her door, and another time that she'd receive calls from a fake number explaining to her why this was being delayed.
With the final payment on the farm looming, Brooklyn puts pressure on Paul for some financial relief. And this turns into his breaking point.
Paul came home and said, "There's no inheritance. There isn't any money coming. There's no money." I slid down the fridge and onto the floor like a cartoon character. The whole game was up.
Furious and deeply betrayed, Brooklyn kicks Paul out.
I was now left with this farm that I had to pay for. I enlisted the support of my dad to help figure out the financial part of it until I was able to sell my house and repay him. Fortunately for me, my father made me sign a prenup with Paul, so I didn't end up having to split our assets. Finally, I had control of my life back again from Paul Carter. Or so I thought.
Paul, cut off from his slush fund, is angry and desperate.
Paul shows up to the farm. He was really angry. And he says to me, "I'm going to kill myself, but I'm going to make sure I take you down with me." And I just felt chills go down my spine.
Brooklyn Carter is finally coming clean with herself about who her husband really is, and she's terrified.
He was not in control of money, property, our child, nothing. The gravy train had well and truly stopped, and it just enraged him. I went out and bought myself a rifle. My son was sleeping with a baseball bat next to his bed. I was terrified of what might happen.
Brooklyn gets a restraining order, and then finally, after 16 years of marriage, she files for divorce.
I couldn't lose any more money. I couldn't lose any more sleep. I couldn't be any more miserable. I thought, if I don't do something now, I'm not even going to have the energy to get out of this marriage.
In August 2019, the divorce becomes final, and Brooklyn gets full custody of Mac.
I couldn't hold back my emotion, and I burst into tears, and my head fell onto the desk in the courtroom.
But there is just one problem.
I became increasingly concerned about being on the same visa as Paul Carter. I decided I needed to get Mac and I a new visa. My very close friend suggested that we get married because we both had no intentions of ever remarrying in our lives.
Brooklyn and her female friend hold a garden wedding in Albany in September 2019.
She was going to come and live at the house that I had built at my farm, and we were just going to grow old together and help each other out and be companions for each other.
Before the couple can even move in together, Brooklyn's life takes an unforeseen turn.
I get a call from 60 Minutes Australia.
He may look like an ordinary bloke, but this is one of Australia's most cunning con men, a ruthless operator who's fleeced millions from family, friends, the rich and the poor.
60 Minutes seemed to have even more information about things that he had done that I had no clue about.
We gave him the moniker the Casanova con man because his biggest cons were of women he made believe that he loved them.
Paul Carter.
They tracked him down at a job site, which was a very rewarding moment to see because they made him come down off the roof and it was just perfect.
Why would you tell Catherine that your partner had died of brain cancer?
Yeah, that was a mistake. I was going through a bad time with my then wife and it was just a mistake.
They knew about the Uniting Church fiasco and they just had facts and figures and numbers on different projects that he was doing. He hadn't had time to prepare any answers, but he still denied everything.
So I keep hearing this, but I don't know who you're talking about.
He's just deny.
What about the Italian inheritance that didn't exist?
There isn't one.
Was that another mistake?
Yeah, it was, yeah.
After the expose, Paul Carter becomes the subject of a Homeland Security investigation.
He had engaged in these fraud schemes for many years with almost no law enforcement intervention. We were able to determine that he had used multiple identities. At that time, his most recent name is Paul Hamilton. We execute a search warrant at his residence. We found a law diploma under the name of Paul Hamilton. We found a document that was fraudulent from the Department of Homeland Security indicating that he had been awarded United States citizenship. We found military uniforms in his closet. We found a document indicating that he was the beneficiary of over $30 million in trust funds. All of these items were in line with what the underlying allegations were about him. We immediately arrested Paul Carter. So we took him into custody on the felony charges of visa fraud and false statements.
This should have been the end of Brooklyn's nightmare with Paul, except that her marriage to him has put her under the microscope of Homeland Security as well.
A couple of months later, it was about 9:30 or 10 o'clock in the morning, and there's a knock on the door. Brooklyn, we need you to open the door. It's Homeland Security.
The execution of the search warrant at Brooklyn's house was specifically in regard to the allegations of marriage fraud against her.
They're bashing on the door. Open the door, Brooklyn. So I opened the door, and 8 agents in bulletproof vests with guns stormed through my door and up the stairs. They took all our cell phones and computers, took my son's gaming computer, everything that they could get their hands on, and sent it to Quantico to get analysed.
Brooklyn is suspected of committing marriage fraud with her wife in order to gain a green card.
I was not prepared to drag her or her family through the mud with the government. This was supposed to be a happy situation for both of us.
Brooklyn divorces her wife in June 2020.
They never charged me with marriage fraud, but it was enough for them to then look at the ESTA form that I'd filled in and decide, oh, well, that's not right either. There was a felony charge for filling in the ESTA while I was still in the United States.
Brooklyn Carter ultimately pled guilty to making false statements on the ESTA application, which is utilized to re-enter the United States at some point.
Paul Carter also faces his day of reckoning in a federal court, and despite the many allegations, he too is charged with visa fraud on April 7th, 2021, and held in an Albany jail.
Paul Carter was sentenced to time served and a $5,000 fine. We were not, as an agency, pleased with the sentence, but he's now a convicted felon, which in part is based on the work that our agency and our office did.
His deportation hearing has been delayed, and now he has moved to the other side of the country and applied for a green card. So it seems that he's bought himself another couple of years of stalling techniques.
I think based on his history, it's likely that he'll come back around. I'd be surprised if we haven't heard the last of Paul Carter.
Meanwhile, because of Brooklyn's conviction, she must leave the United States. A huge disappointment, but there is a silver lining. A man named Sean Donahue.
I heard that she had to leave the country, and I said, I'm going to marry you, and I'm going to get your son away from Paul. And if he'll have me and you'll allow it, I'm going to adopt him and make him a Donahue.
I can't overstate how wonderful he has been to Mac and I. He's the happy ending that we deserve. I've brought chaos to this man's life, and he's still there standing right beside me. And I believe he will be till our dying days.
We're happy as can be now. We are not going to let anybody shatter our marriage. And I'll be with Brooklyn as soon as I can in another country at the soonest available time.
I've been dragged through the gates of hell to get to the happy ending. I've come out the other end. It's going to make a good story for my grandchildren, that's for sure.
The year is 1946. The season is spring. In the natural order of the world, spring is traditionally a time of renewal, a gentle period when the bitter cold of winter gives way to blossoming life, warmer breezes, and a collective sense of profound hope. But in the unique, dual-state border town of Texarkana, a community uniquely geographically situated straddling the invisible boundary line between the vast, sprawling landscapes of Texas and the dense, rugged terrains of Arkansas, the spring of 1946 would not bring forth any feelings of rejuvenation or peace. Instead, this particular spring would mercilessly usher in a season of unprecedented, paralyzing terror, plunging the entirety of the community into a dark, suffocating nightmare that would forever alter its local history and permanently scar the collective psyche of the American public. This narrative is not merely a recounting of a series of brutal, isolated crimes. It is a haunting, deeply unsettling exploration of the sudden loss of innocence, the profound, tragic vulnerability of youth, and the grim birth of a terrifying cultural archetype that continues to relentlessly haunt the modern imagination to this very day. Texarkana in the early to mid-20th century was, by all accounts, a relatively quiet, unassuming, and closely knit place. It was the quintessential American town where people knew their neighbors by their first names, where the daily rhythm of life was predictably steady, and where a prevailing sense of safety was simply taken for granted as a fundamental right of existence. The community was inherently defined by its unusual dual identity, literally sharing a name, a main street, and a physical space across two distinct state jurisdictions, yet remaining tightly unified by a shared, localized culture. However, lurking just beneath this comfortable, picturesque veneer of small-town tranquility, a sinister, unfathomable presence was quietly beginning to stir in the shadows. Over the agonizing course of 10 grueling, blood-soaked weeks, the unsuspecting residents of this peaceful border town would suddenly find themselves being actively, systematically hunted. They would be forced, against their will, to confront a brand of evil so profound, so entirely faceless, and so relentlessly cruel that it would shatter their fundamental understanding of security, trust, and human nature. The sole architect of this unimaginable suffering would eventually come to be known by a dark, mysterious moniker that perfectly encapsulated his elusive, terrifying nature. The press and the terrified public alike called him the Phantom Killer. To truly comprehend the sheer, overwhelming magnitude of the terror that gripped Texarkana during those agonizing 10 weeks, one must first understand the specific hunting ground chosen by this monstrous individual. He did not stalk the busy, well-lit main streets, nor did he initially target the secure, locked homes of the wealthy or the prominent. Instead, he turned his malicious attention to the isolated, quiet, and intimately secluded areas on the shadowy outskirts of the town. These were the areas colloquially and universally known as lovers' lanes. In 1946, the concept of the lover's lane held a very specific, almost sacred place in the culture of American youth. For young couples seeking a brief, private escape from the watchful eyes of their parents, their siblings, and their tightly knit, gossiping communities, these remote dirt roads and completely unlit wooded clearings offered a rare, precious sanctuary of privacy. Parked inside their automobiles beneath the sprawling canopy of the night sky, young men and women could find a quiet, isolated space for intimate conversation, innocent romance, and the simple, uninterrupted comfort of each other's company. The car was not just a vehicle. It temporarily became a private, secure bubble, a small, enclosed universe entirely separated from the outside world. But it was precisely within this vulnerable, enclosed bubble that the Phantom Killer chose to strike, fundamentally perverting a space of young love into a grotesque stage for unimaginable violence and sudden death. The killer's modus operandi was as calculated as it was devastatingly brutal. He operated almost exclusively under the cover of the weekend nights, often choosing the times when the moon was bright in the sky. The moonlight, which under normal circumstances would cast a romantic, silver glow over the parked vehicles of the young couples, instead acted as a chilling spotlight for the predator, illuminating his tragic prey while allowing him to navigate the surrounding dense woods and dirt paths with deadly, silent precision. The very environmental elements that made the Lover's Lane so attractive to the youth of Texarkana, the quiet isolation, the distance from the main roads, the enveloping darkness, were weaponized by the Phantom Killer to ensure that no one could hear the desperate, agonizing screams of his victims, and that no immediate help could possibly arrive in time to intervene. What elevated this string of vicious attacks from a series of local tragedies into a legendary, national nightmare was the horrifying, indelible image of the killer himself. The survivors of his initial wrath, and the terrifying evidence left behind, painted a picture of an entity that seemed to step directly out of the darkest, most twisted corners of a child's nightmare. The attacker was described as a tall figure, standing approximately 1.8 meters, or roughly 6 feet in height, towering over his victims with a menacing, physical dominance. But it was his face, or rather, the complete, chilling absence of a human face, that cemented his status as a figure of pure, unadulterated terror. The Phantom Killer systematically obscured his identity by wearing a crude, makeshift mask fashioned out of a simple, rough white burlap sack. He had carefully, deliberately cut 2 ragged holes into the coarse fabric, just large enough for his own eyes to peer out and observe the sheer terror he was inflicting upon his helpless victims. This white burlap mask was not a sophisticated disguise. It was rough, dirty, and profoundly deeply unsettling in its crude simplicity. It stripped the attacker of any recognizable human emotion, any trace of empathy, or any identifiable human characteristics, transforming him from a mere mortal man into a blank canvas of pure, unstoppable malice. When the terrified young men and women looked out of their car windows, or were violently dragged into the cold night air, they did not see a person looking back at them. They saw only the rough, white fabric of a sack and the cold, dead gaze staring out from the dark voids of the eye holes. This specific imagery, the isolated lover's lane, the darkness of the woods, and the large, silent killer wearing a featureless, improvised mask, would eventually transcend the horrific reality of the Texarkana crimes. It would later lay the crucial, defining groundwork for an entire subgenre of popular culture, essentially birthing the archetype of the masked, unstoppable slasher that would go on to dominate horror cinema for decades to come. As the 10 weeks of the Phantom Killer's reign of terror painfully dragged on, the nature of his violence became increasingly, horrifyingly sadistic. He was not merely content with the act of killing. His crimes were characterized by an intense, lingering cruelty that spoke of a deeply disturbed, violent psychological state. The male victims, the young boys who had merely driven their partners out for a quiet evening, were typically dispatched with cold, ruthless efficiency, usually subjected to fatal gunshot wounds. But the female victims were subjected to prolonged, unspeakable horrors. The Phantom Killer inflicted severe psychological trauma, brutal physical torture, and horrific sexual violence upon the young women before ultimately ending their lives. The profound discrepancy in how he treated the male and female victims highlighted a deeply ingrained, predatory hatred, a desire not just to extinguish life, but to completely degrade, violate, and utterly destroy the innocent victims who had the tragic misfortune of crossing his path on those lonely, moonlit nights. The cascading psychological effect of these brutal, unrelenting crimes on the town of Texarkana was absolutely catastrophic. As the body count slowly but surely rose, and as the horrifying, gruesome details of the attacks began to inevitably filter through the tight-knit community, the previous atmosphere of post-war optimism entirely evaporated, instantly replaced by a thick, suffocating blanket of collective paranoia and raw, visceral fear. Texarkana fundamentally ceased to be a normal, functioning town and rapidly transformed into a community existing in a state of perpetual, agonizing siege. The residents, realizing that a masked, seemingly invisible monster was freely roaming their rural outskirts, instinctively implemented a spontaneous, rigid, and strictly enforced form of self-imposed martial law. The immediate transformation of the daily life in Texarkana was stark and deeply, deeply depressing. As the sun began to slowly set each evening, casting long, ominous shadows across the streets and the surrounding woods, a heavy, deafening silence would swiftly fall over the entire region. The previously bustling local businesses, the vibrant diners, and the lively theaters began shutting their doors uncharacteristically early, their owners rushing home to the perceived safety of their own locked walls. The usually active, noisy streets became completely deserted, entirely abandoned, resembling the quiet, eerie emptiness of a ghost town long before the midnight hour even approached. The simple, everyday act of going outside after dark became an unthinkable, terrifying risk that no sensible person was willing to take. Parents, gripped by a frantic, protective terror, absolutely forbade their teenagers from leaving the house after twilight, completely eliminating the social life of the town's youth, and entirely abandoning the once popular lovers' lanes to the cold wind and the haunting memory of the phantom. Inside the homes of the residents, the atmosphere was equally tense, fraught with anxiety, and defined by a desperate, frantic need for self-preservation. Citizens frantically emptied the shelves of local hardware and sporting goods stores, buying up absolutely every available firearm, every box of ammunition, and every heavy-duty lock they could possibly find. Homes were hurriedly, haphazardly converted into makeshift, heavily fortified fortresses. Families spent their tense evenings frantically nailing thick, heavy wooden planks over their fragile glass windows, desperately trying to create an impenetrable, physical barrier between the warmth of their living rooms and the terrifying, unknown darkness that loomed just outside their properties. People sat wide awake in their armchairs with loaded shotguns resting heavily across their laps, nervously jumping at the slightest, innocuous sound. The snapping of a dry twig in the yard, the sudden howling of a stray dog, or the gentle rustling of the spring wind against the sides of the house. Sleep became a rare, difficult luxury, constantly interrupted by the persistent, gnawing fear that the man with the white burlap face might currently be standing quietly on their front porch. This pervasive, agonizing terror reached an absolute, fevered crescendo during the killer's final, most audacious attack, an event that violently shattered any remaining illusions of safety. In a terrifying deviation from his established pattern of exclusively hunting in the remote lovers' lanes, the Phantom Killer aggressively escalated his campaign of violence by directly targeting an isolated, rural farmhouse located miles away from the town center. By brazenly firing through a closed living room window at a man simply sitting in his own home, the killer effectively delivered a chilling, unmistakable message to the entirety of Texarkana. Absolutely nowhere was safe. Not the lonely dirt roads, not the dark woods, and certainly not the locked, warmly lit sanctuaries of their very own living rooms. The invisible boundary between the dangerous outside world and the secure interior of the home had been completely, violently obliterated. The sheer scale of the panic naturally necessitated a massive, unprecedented law enforcement response. The small local police force, entirely overwhelmed and unequipped to handle a serial predator of this magnitude, was quickly joined by the legendary, highly formidable investigators of the Texas Rangers, alongside numerous specialized agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. But despite the heavy, overwhelming presence of seasoned law enforcement, despite the cleverly laid traps involving brave officers disguised as vulnerable couples parked in the dark, and despite the hundreds of exhaustive, intense interrogations, the Phantom Killer remained entirely elusive, always seeming to stay one frustrating step ahead of the desperate men trying to hunt him down. He was a shadow, a terrifying whisper in the dark that struck with brutal force and then simply, impossibly, melted back into the night without leaving a definitive trace. The tragic, enduring legacy of the Texarkana Moonlight murders is heavily defined not just by the extreme brutality of the crimes themselves, but by the agonizing, permanent lack of resolution. The agonizing truth that the Phantom Killer was never officially identified, never formally paraded before a judge, and never legally brought to proper justice has allowed his dark legend to fester and continuously grow over the subsequent decades. The terrifying reality of the events of 1946 eventually blurred the lines between historical, factual tragedy and dark, whispered urban legend. The raw, visceral fear experienced by the residents of that border town was eventually heavily immortalized in popular culture, most notably inspiring the chilling, critically discussed independent film, The Town That Dreaded Sundown. But behind the eventual cinematic adaptations and the enduring campfire stories lies a very real, deeply sorrowful history of a community irreversibly broken, of young, innocent lives violently, tragically extinguished, and of a profound, lingering terror that permanently redefined the deep, dark spaces where the moonlight cannot quite reach. The year 1946 was supposed to be a chapter of profound healing for the American landscape, a time to slowly recover from the vast, global trauma of the Second World War. However, in the dual-state border town of Texarkana, this period of anticipated peace was violently, permanently ruptured. To truly comprehend the absolute gravity of the Phantom Killer's brutal crimes, we must first deeply and emphatically understand the very individuals whose lives were violently intercepted by his reign of terror. These victims were not merely names coldly recorded on faded, yellowing police reports, nor were they simply distant statistics compiled in a dusty historical archive. They were breathing, living human beings, deeply embedded in the intricate, tight-knit social fabric of their local community. They possessed vibrant dreams, loving families, unique personal talents, and quiet, mundane evenings that were meant to end safely in the comfortable warmth of their own beds. The primary targets of this unprecedented, monstrous malice were the youth of the town, young people actively engaging in a widespread, entirely innocent cultural practice that largely defined their generation. The lovers' lanes of Texarkana were essentially isolated stretches of rural dirt roads, completely devoid of municipal lighting, and entirely surrounded by the thick, encroaching density of the regional woodlands. For the young men and women of that era, these secluded areas were not considered inherently dangerous. They were deeply valued as rare sanctuaries. In a specific time period before the absolute ubiquity of private teenage spaces, the automobile provided a rolling, temporary haven of independence. Parking along these quiet, rural fringes allowed couples to successfully escape the suffocating heat of crowded households, the perpetually watchful eyes of their strict parents, and the often claustrophobic gossip of small-town existence. It was a private space strictly reserved for quiet conversations, shared intimate secrets, and the gentle, innocent blossoming of young romance under the watchful, silent gaze of the spring moon. It was within this specific, highly vulnerable context of youthful innocence that the killer found his perfect hunting ground, violently turning a cherished symbol of coming of age into a dark landscape of unimaginable, paralyzing dread. The first individuals to directly encounter this walking, breathing nightmare were Jimmy Hollis, a young man of 25, and his companion, Mary Jean Larry, who was just 19 years old. Their harrowing, deeply traumatic experience on the 22nd of February, 1946, marked the terrifying, violent genesis of the Phantom's campaign. Jimmy and Mary Jean represented the quintessential young couple simply seeking a quiet moment of privacy, completely unaware that they were about to tragically become the inaugural victims of a ruthless serial predator. The sudden, violent shattering of their peaceful evening formally introduced the border town to a completely new, unfathomable breed of terror. When the tall man, standing approximately 1.8 meters in height and wearing a crude white burlap sack over his head, approached their parked vehicle, he did not merely intend to rob them. His ultimate goal was total domination and profound physical destruction. Jimmy was violently, forcefully removed from the perceived safety of his car, ordered to lie face down on the cold ground, and subjected to a merciless, deeply savage beating. The sheer, overwhelming force of the blows delivered to his head, inflicted with the heavy, solid stock of a firearm, was so severe that it entirely fractured his skull, leaving the young man gravely injured and completely incapacitated. With Jimmy brutally subdued, the masked attacker, who ominously referred to himself as a phantom, turned his malevolent attention directly to the 19-year-old Mary Jean. She was subjected to a horrific, deeply traumatizing sexual assault, violently violated with the cold steel barrel of the attacker's weapon. In a remarkable moment of sheer, desperate survival instinct, Mary Jean managed to miraculously break free from her tormentor, fleeing blindly through the dark, unforgiving woods until she finally reached a nearby house to frantically summon emergency assistance. Both Jimmy and Mary Jean physically survived that deeply horrific night, but they were forever burdened with the severe, lingering psychological trauma of the attack and the haunting, indelible memory of the faceless figure looming over them in the dark. Their survival, while a profound blessing, also served as a dark, ominous warning to the community, a terrible warning that largely went unheeded until the violence inevitably, tragically escalated. Tragically, the killer's subsequent targets would not be afforded the same miraculous opportunity to escape with their lives. Exactly 1 month later, on the 24th of March, the stark, brutal reality of the Phantom's lethal intentions was fully realized with the grim, heartbreaking discovery of Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore. Richard, aged 29, and Polly Ann, a young girl of merely 17 years old, had parked their vehicle along a desolate, unpaved stretch known locally as Richard Road. They were seeking the exact same quiet solitude as Jimmy and Mary Jean, completely oblivious to the horrifying fact that this remote, shadowy location would serve as their final resting place on Earth. The brutal, unforgiving nature of their murders marked a significant, terrifying escalation in the masked killer's methodology. The physical evidence meticulously gathered at the grim crime scene suggested a deeply chilling, methodical sequence of events. Richard and Polly were not simply shot from a distance while sitting inside their car. They were forcibly, violently removed from the secure confines of their automobile and ruthlessly executed outside in the cold night air. Both victims suffered fatal, devastating gunshot wounds directly to the back of the head, a method of killing that was completely cold, highly calculated, and entirely devoid of any human mercy. The weapon utilized in this double homicide was a .32 caliber handgun, a specific ballistic detail that would later become a crucial, defining signature of the unknown assailant. But the sheer psychological cruelty of the act did not conclude with the firing of the weapon. In a bizarre, deeply unsettling display of post-mortem manipulation, the killer painstakingly lifted their lifeless, bleeding bodies and placed them back inside their parked vehicle before quietly vanishing into the surrounding darkness. The eventual discovery of their bodies sent a massive, paralyzing shockwave of absolute horror directly through the town of Texarkana. The terrifying realization that the brutal attacker from February had confidently returned, and that he was now actively, successfully hunting to kill, transformed the town's initial, lingering unease into a state of full-blown, collective panic. If the brutal murders of Richard and Polly deeply terrified the community, the subsequent attack on the 14th of April pushed the town entirely to the absolute brink of despair, representing the undeniable apex of the Phantom's sadistic, unrelenting brutality. The victims were tragically, heartbreakingly young, their lives completely saturated with unfulfilled potential and innocent joy. Paul Martin was a young teenage boy of only 17, and his companion, Betty Jo Booker, was a mere 15 years old. Their fateful evening had not even begun on a remote dirt road. It had started safely in town with music. Betty Jo was a talented, deeply passionate musician who played the saxophone in a local musical group, and the two teenagers had simply been returning home together following one of her evening performances. They were practically children, still entirely enveloped in the safety of their youth, making their way back to their respective homes after a night of innocent, creative expression. The violent, sudden interception of their journey is perhaps the most deeply heartbreaking and disturbing chapter of the entire ordeal. Paul's body was eventually discovered lying abandoned by the side of a rural road, completely riddled with lethal gunshot wounds. The sheer volume of the gunfire indicated a frenzied, overwhelming level of absolute violence directed at the teenage boy. But the ultimate fate of 15-year-old Betty Jo was unspeakably, horrifically worse. Her body was located over 3 kilometers away from Paul's remains, hidden deep within a dense, heavily wooded, and highly isolated area. She had been shot twice, but the absolute horror of her tragic death lay in the extensive, deeply disturbing signs of severe torture and brutal sexual abuse inflicted upon her small frame before the fatal shots were ultimately fired. In a deeply poignant, tragically symbolic detail noted by the authorities, Betty Jo's beloved saxophone was discovered completely missing from the immediate crime scene. It was only later found discarded separately, abandoned entirely amongst the trees in the dark forest. The silent, misplaced musical instrument served as a devastating, highly powerful physical representation of the music that had been permanently, violently silenced, and the innocent, joyful life that had been so ruthlessly extinguished by the man in the white burlap mask. Up until the tragic, bloody month of May, the established profile of the Phantom Killer's targets was terribly, frighteningly clear to the terrified public and the frustrated investigators alike. He hunted exclusively at night, he targeted the isolated, wooded lovers' lanes, and his victims were universally young couples parked in vehicles on the rural, unlit outskirts of the town. This rigid, terrifying pattern had directly dictated the community's desperate, defensive response, leading them to entirely abandon the dark roads and frantically secure their teenage children safely indoors after sunset. However, on the 3rd of May 1946, the killer completely, violently shattered every established assumption regarding his methodology, fundamentally shifting his victimology and plunging the entire region into a state of entirely unprecedented claustrophobic terror. He completely abandoned the isolated dirt roads and instead directed his malevolent, unpredictable focus toward a private, secluded farmhouse situated nearly 20 kilometers away from the main town center. The victims of this final, devastating assault were not vulnerable, parked teenagers, but rather a mature, established married couple resting securely within the solid walls of their own property. Virgil Starks, a 37-year-old local farmer, was simply enjoying a quiet, entirely uneventful evening, peacefully reading his daily newspaper while relaxing comfortably in his favorite armchair in his own living room. He was entirely unaware that the face of pure, unadulterated evil was quietly observing him through the dark glass of his own window. The killer, standing completely outside in the protective shadows of the night, aimed his weapon directly through the window pane and fired, striking Virgil and ending his life instantly in a completely unprovoked, entirely cowardly ambush. The sudden, deafening shattering of the living room glass and the explosive, terrifying sound of the gunfire instantly alerted Virgil's wife, Katie Starks, who was located in an adjacent room of the farmhouse. Driven by pure instinct and a desperate, panicked need to understand the source of the terrible commotion, Katie rushed immediately toward the living room, only to be violently met by the killer's relentless, unhesitating gunfire. The unseen attacker fired again through the shattered window frame, striking Katie directly in the face with 2 successive, devastating shots. The physical devastation inflicted upon her was absolute and horrific, leaving her gravely wounded, entirely disoriented, and rapidly losing massive amounts of blood onto the floor of her home. Yet, in an awe-inspiring, almost superhuman display of sheer will and desperate survival instinct, Katie Starks completely refused to succumb to the darkness rapidly enveloping her own home. Despite her catastrophic, highly life-threatening facial injuries, she managed to miraculously flee the blood-soaked farmhouse, running blindly and desperately through the dark, perilous night to finally reach the safety of a neighboring property to frantically beg for emergency assistance. Her miraculous, agonizing survival marked the absolute end of the Phantom's active reign of violence, but the sheer, unprecedented audacity of attacking a man inside his own locked house permanently altered the psychological landscape of the region. The victims of the Phantom Killer were no longer just the youths seeking privacy in the dark. They were absolutely every single citizen, vulnerable even in the supposed absolute sanctuary of their own living rooms, eternally haunted by the devastating knowledge that the terror lurking in the woods could simply walk up to their windows at any given moment. The aftermath of the devastating attack on the Starks farmhouse served as the final, absolute catalyst that propelled the town of Texarkana into a state of total, paralyzed catatonia. The initial localized fear that had once been restricted to the remote, rural lovers' lanes had now completely evaporated. In its place was a visceral, suffocating terror that resided in every living room, every hallway, and every darkened doorway across the entire community. As the authorities scrambled to piece together the fragments of a mystery that seemed to defy all conventional criminal logic, the residents of Texarkana began their own, desperate, and deeply frantic descent into a new reality, defined entirely by the absence of safety. The silence that fell over the town after sunset was not the peaceful, natural quiet of a rural community at rest. It was a heavy, expectant, and highly charged silence of a population waiting, with bated breath, for the next strike of a monster they could not see, could not understand, and most terrifyingly could not stop. The response from law enforcement, while massive and incredibly well-resourced, was plagued from its very inception by the sheer, phantom-like nature of their adversary. When the Texas Rangers arrived, led by the legendary and notoriously formidable Captain Manuel Lone Wolf Gonzalez, the town breathed a temporary, fragile sigh of relief. Gonzalez was a figure of immense reputation, a man whose very name was synonymous with relentless, uncompromising pursuit and justice. He brought with him a level of tactical experience and iron-willed determination that, in any other situation, would have undoubtedly quelled the escalating panic. Alongside him, agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation fanned out across the rural landscape, bringing the sophisticated, scientific, and systematic methodologies of federal criminal investigation to bear on the rural Texarkana setting. They set up specialized task forces, cataloged evidence with meticulous, painstaking precision, and conducted exhaustive, soul-searching interviews with every single person who had even the slightest, most tenuous connection to the areas where the crimes had occurred. However, the Phantom Killer possessed a chilling, inherent understanding of the very terrain he stalked. He did not behave like a criminal who left behind sloppy, traceable mistakes. He acted with the calculated, precise awareness of a predator who knew the environment better than the men who were hunting him. The law enforcement agencies, desperate to break the pattern, initiated a series of high-stakes, dangerous operations designed to bait the killer into revealing his hand. They utilized undercover officers, carefully pairing them as young couples in parked vehicles parked in the exact, isolated, and shadowy locations where the previous attacks had taken place. These officers, often equipped with hidden radio equipment and heavily armed, sat in the darkness for hours upon agonizing hours, their hearts hammering against their ribs, waiting for the appearance of a man with a white burlap sack over his head. It was a harrowing, psychologically grueling endeavor that forced these men and women to place themselves directly in the path of a murderous, unknown entity. Yet, despite the meticulous planning, despite the sheer bravery of the decoys, and despite the hundreds of eyes constantly scanning the dark woods, the killer never once took the bait. He seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to sense the presence of authority, to anticipate the traps, and to vanish into the thin, cool night air whenever the net tightened even slightly. The frustration among the investigative team grew to a fever pitch. Every dead-end lead, every contradictory witness statement, and every passing day without a capture served to amplify the sense of complete, crushing powerlessness. They were hunting a ghost, a silhouette in the moonlight, a man who, in the eyes of the terrified public, was capable of walking through locked walls and disappearing into solid earth. The pressure to produce a suspect, to provide the citizens of Texarkana with a face to fear and a name to blame, became entirely all-consuming. It was within this environment of absolute, desperate necessity that the name of Yowl Swinney began to rise to the surface of the investigation. Swinney was a man with a troubled, violent history, a career criminal who had spent a significant portion of his adult life navigating the various, darker corners of the legal system. He was a man well known to the local authorities, a persistent, petty thief, and a volatile figure whose presence in the community was already viewed with suspicion. When he finally came under the intense, magnifying lens of the task force, the investigators found in him a figure who, at least in the eyes of a frustrated and cornered police force, appeared to be the only individual with the combination of motive, opportunity, and known, inherent capacity for unpredictable, uncontrolled violence. The investigation into Swinney quickly became the central, singular focal point of the entire effort to close the file on the Phantom Killer. He was brought in for intense, repeated, and grueling interrogations, forced to account for his movements, his associations, and his actions during the long, dark weeks of the spring of 1946. But it was the involvement of his wife, Peggy, that initially provided the investigators with the explosive, game-changing breakthrough they had so desperately prayed for. Peggy, caught in the middle of a collapsing marriage and an environment of extreme, sustained pressure, eventually offered a detailed, damning account that shattered the walls of Swinney's defenses. She claimed, with a clarity that seemed to stun the detectives, that her husband was indeed the man responsible for the string of murders. She insisted that she had been present with him during the commission of the crimes, acting as a reluctant witness to the unspeakable, violent acts of the man with the white burlap mask. She provided the investigators with intimate, chillingly specific details regarding the murders, details that were, by their very nature, known only to the killer and the elite, small circle of detectives directly handling the case. The weight of Peggy's testimony, combined with the discovery of seemingly damning, circumstantial evidence, appeared to the public and the media to be the final, necessary piece of the puzzle. Investigators pointed to the vehicle Swinney was known to use, noting that its tires and physical characteristics bore a haunting, significant resemblance to the tracks and sightings reported at the scenes of the various assaults. The discovery of a shirt, stained with blood and tucked away in the depths of his belongings, was held up as a smoking gun, a physical, undeniable link between Swinney and the gore of the crimes. To the desperate, weary investigators, the case against Yowl Swinney was nearly complete. They had their man, they had the motive, and they had the testimony of a woman who claimed to have watched him kill. The narrative of the Phantom Killer, a legend that had been built on the terrifying, shapeless anonymity of a man in a sack, was rapidly being replaced by the mundane, recognizable reality of a violent, small-time criminal. Yet, as the legal process began to unfold, the structural, systemic limitations of the time started to tear the case apart from the inside. The legal, cultural, and judicial landscape of 1946 Texas contained rigid, deeply entrenched rules that would ultimately prove to be an insurmountable obstacle for the prosecution. The most significant of these was the established, historical legal principle concerning marital testimony. Under the laws governing the courts of Texas during that period, a wife was not legally obligated, and in many cases was strictly prohibited, from providing testimony that could be used to directly condemn her own husband in a court of law. This legal protection, intended to preserve the sanctity of the marital bond, became the ultimate, impenetrable shield for Yowl Swinney. When the time came for the prosecution to formalize their charges, when the evidence needed to be presented before a jury and translated into a definitive, binding conviction, the primary pillar of their entire case, the testimony of his wife, began to crumble. Peggy, facing the gravity of the potential consequences, or perhaps swayed by the complicated, volatile nature of their bond, ultimately and definitively refused to testify against her husband. The immediate, crushing impact of her refusal was a direct, devastating blow to the state's case. Without her direct, sworn account on the record, the circumstantial evidence, while suggestive, was entirely insufficient to secure a conviction for the series of brutal, life-altering murders. The investigators, who had spent months building the case, who had spent countless hours in the dark, and who had promised the terrified citizens of Texarkana a sense of closure and justice, were forced to watch their primary suspect slip through the cracks of the system. The sheer, agonizing irony of the situation was lost on no one. A man the authorities were almost entirely certain had terrorized a community to the point of collapse would remain walking free because of the very same legal system that was designed to protect the people he had so savagely hunted. The frustration, the anger, and the deep, abiding sense of injustice that followed this failure would haunt the investigators for the rest of their lives. It was not a failure of will or a failure of effort. It was a cold, institutional wall that the truth could not penetrate. However, the state of Texas, unwilling to let a man of Swinney's criminal record entirely evade the reach of the law, turned to a different, less direct, yet ultimately effective strategy. They moved away from the complex, high-stakes accusations of murder and instead pivoted toward the concrete, provable reality of his history of vehicle theft. Utilizing the powerful, aggressive legal tools found in the state's statutes regarding habitual, repeat offenders, the prosecution managed to secure a conviction that would, at the very least, physically remove Swinney from the streets of Texarkana for the foreseeable, long-term future. In 1947, the judicial hammer finally fell. Yowl Swinney was sentenced to a term of life imprisonment, a punishment that was intended to serve as a final, decisive conclusion to his reign of criminal activity. For the people of Texarkana, the moment the heavy, iron doors of the state prison finally shut behind him, the terror that had defined their lives finally, definitively dissipated. The connection between his incarceration and the immediate, total cessation of the Phantom Killer's attacks was so stark, so unmistakable, and so final that for many in the community, the debate over his guilt was already closed. He was the man, he was the monster, and he was finally where he belonged. Yet, the legal, formal, and ultimate acknowledgement of his guilt for the actual, horrific murders remained a shadow, an unresolved, unanswered question that would drift through the decades to come, leaving the mystery of the Phantom Killer to exist in that uncomfortable, gray space between historical fact and enduring, whispered local legend. The final chapter of the mystery would never be officially written. The long, arduous process of investigation into the Phantom Killer of Texarkana was, in its essence, a monumental struggle against the encroaching darkness of the unknown. As the authorities navigated the labyrinthine paths of evidence, rumors, and the terrifying void left by a suspect who seemed to evaporate at will, the actual mechanical procedures of the investigation became a study in persistence and, ultimately, profound frustration. The primary challenge facing the combined forces of the local police, the Texas Rangers, and the federal agents was the complete absence of a consistent, physical link between the various crime scenes that could lead them to a specific perpetrator. Each location, from the lonely, unpaved stretches of Richard Road to the bloodied living room of the Starks farmhouse, was treated as an independent theater of war against an enemy who left almost nothing behind. The detectives meticulously combed through the rural terrain, looking for footprints, discarded shell casings, or the smallest discarded article of clothing that might reveal the identity of the person who wore the white burlap sack. They analyzed the ballistic signatures of the .32 caliber rounds, hoping for a match that would definitively prove the same weapon was used across all 5 incidents. They tracked the movements of every known transient, every local inhabitant with a history of behavioral instability, and every person whose presence near the lovers' lanes could even tangentially be correlated with the timeline of the terror. The investigative effort was structured in a way that mirrored the sheer, overwhelming panic that had taken hold of the community. Every time a new report of a suspicious individual emerged, the entire machinery of law enforcement would pivot with desperate speed to investigate the lead. They interviewed hundreds of people, ranging from nervous teenagers who had witnessed distant, shadowy movements, to farm laborers who had noticed unusual activity near the rural roads during the quiet hours of the night. Each interrogation was a high-pressure environment, as the detectives, driven by the knowledge that another couple could be hunted at any moment, pushed their witnesses and suspects to recall details that were, in the heat of the moment, largely blurred by terror. The psychological toll on the investigators was immense, as they were forced to confront the same horrific scenes repeatedly, documenting the carnage of the victims while simultaneously trying to maintain the analytical distance necessary to build a viable case. They spent their days in the intense, sweltering heat of the Texas and Arkansas spring, scouring the woods and dusty roads, and their nights in dimly lit offices, staring at maps and case files, attempting to find a pattern that would provide them with the identity of the ghost they were hunting. One of the most critical, yet ultimately deeply demoralizing aspects of the investigation was the deployment of undercover decoys. This strategy, which seemed like the most logical, proactive measure to trap a predator who specifically targeted vulnerable, parked vehicles, was executed with a high level of risk and strategic planning. Pairs of officers, both men and women, would park their vehicles in the known danger zones, simulating the behavior of unsuspecting couples. They sat in the dark for hours, armed and vigilant, waiting for the telltale sound of a vehicle approaching or the sight of a figure emerging from the brush. It was a harrowing psychological gauntlet. The officers had to balance the need to appear genuinely vulnerable, to not act as a deterrent, with the need to remain constantly aware and ready to respond to an immediate lethal threat. The silence of the woods during these long, agonizing night shifts was deafening, amplified by the heavy anticipation of a possible attack. They listened for the snapping of twigs, the low hum of an approaching car, or the quiet, metallic click of a weapon being readied. However, the phantom killer's awareness of his environment remained remarkably, unervingly superior. It was as if he could sense the eyes of the law observing him, or as if he simply possessed an uncanny ability to choose moments when the authorities were not currently positioned in his path. The fact that not once did he stumble into these traps added a layer of eerie, near-supernatural mystery to his persona, further fueling the rumors and the dark, local legends that continued to circulate through the town. The investigation reached a pivotal, critical inflection point when the focus of the task force began to narrow exclusively onto Yowl Swinney. Up until this stage, the list of potential suspects was broad, yet entirely lacking in definitive evidence. Swinney's emergence into the center of the investigation was driven by his established criminal background and the persistent, nagging feeling among the investigators that he possessed the temperament and the erratic, violent tendencies to commit such crimes. The process of gathering evidence against him became the primary focus, as the detectives shifted from a broad search for any potential culprit to an intensive, building case against a single, specific individual. They scrutinized every aspect of his life, his social connections, and his recent history, looking for anything that could connect him to the specific signatures of the Phantom's crimes. When the information provided by his wife, Peggy, surfaced, it was initially viewed as the final piece of the monumental, difficult task they had been struggling to complete for weeks. Her testimony, detailing her own presence during the commission of the crimes, provided the detectives with a level of insight into the mind and actions of the killer that they had previously lacked. The specific details that Peggy shared with the investigators were meticulously recorded. They included descriptions of the killer's behavior, the way he approached the victims, the specific weapons he used, and the chilling, matter-of-fact way he treated his victims before, during, and after the attacks. These details were cross-referenced with the physical evidence gathered at the scenes, creating a coherent, if still largely circumstantial, case. The presence of the blood-stained shirt in Swinney's possession, while not definitively linked to a specific victim through the limited forensic science of the 1940s, was treated as a powerful, symbolic piece of incriminating evidence. The detectives felt a genuine sense of relief and progress as they started to organize these materials into a formal structure that could be presented to the judicial authorities. They believed that they had successfully navigated the darkness, that the nightmare was nearing its conclusion, and that they would finally be able to provide the terrified residents of Texarkana with the answer they were so desperately seeking. The subsequent legal maneuvering was as complex and frustrating as the investigation itself. As the prosecutors prepared to move against Swinney, they encountered the rigid, unyielding walls of the legal system. The procedural requirements to bring a suspect to trial and secure a conviction for capital crimes were exceptionally high, and the reliance on a witness who was fundamentally compromised by her marital status and her own potential complicity created a precarious situation. The courtroom proceedings, though never culminating in a full trial for the murders, were a battleground of strategy and legal technicalities. The prosecutors had to decide how to present the information Peggy had provided, knowing that her ability to testify could be challenged or outright barred by the defense. They had to weigh the risk of a high-profile, unsuccessful murder trial against the potential of securing a conviction for a related, lesser charge that would still achieve the primary goal: removing Swinney from society. This process required a high level of coordination between the district attorneys, the local law enforcement, and the investigators who had spent so much of their lives building the case. It was a period of intense, focused work, characterized by long hours of legal research and the careful preparation of the state's position. Ultimately, the failure to proceed with a formal murder trial against Swinney was not due to a lack of conviction on the part of the investigators, but due to the reality that a strong, circumstantial case is not always sufficient to overcome the high bar of proof required in a court of law. The decision to pivot to the habitual criminal statutes regarding auto theft was a pragmatic, necessary response to the reality of the situation. It was a way to ensure that justice, in some form, was served, even if it wasn't the ideal, definitive justice that would have come with a murder conviction. The trial for his criminal activities, while not addressing the horrors of the Phantom's attacks, provided a resolution that allowed the community to begin the long process of healing. The courtroom was filled with observers, both from the town and from the broader media landscape, who were eager to see the man who had been at the center of the largest, most terrifying manhunt in their history. The atmosphere was one of restrained, tense anticipation as the testimony regarding his past crimes was presented. For the citizens of Texarkana, seeing Swinney sentenced to life in prison felt like a decisive turning point. It was a symbolic end to the period of the Moonlight murders. The fear that had been a constant companion in their daily lives began to recede, replaced by a quiet, collective resolve to move forward, even as the unanswered questions about the true identity of the Phantom Killer continued to linger in the background of their communal life. The investigators, having done everything they could within the limits of the system, were finally able to set aside the files, even if they could never fully set aside the memories of what they had seen and heard during those 10 terrifying weeks. The legal landscape of 1947 was a stern, uncompromising arena, and for Yowl Swinney, it was the final, inevitable destination after the whirlwind of investigations that had gripped Texarkana. The courtroom proceedings were not a trial for the specific murders that had decimated the community's sense of security. Rather, they were a meticulously constructed legal response that utilized the harsh reality of habitual criminal statutes to address the menace he represented. As the proceedings unfolded, the atmosphere within the courtroom was thick with a mixture of suppressed rage, relief, and an enduring, haunting curiosity. The townspeople, who had lived under the shadow of the burlap-masked Phantom for 10 agonizing weeks, watched with intense focus, hoping for some shred of acknowledgement or a definitive, spoken connection between the man sitting before them and the horrors that had occurred in the lovers' lanes. However, the legal strategy adopted by the prosecution meant that the trial focused almost exclusively on Swinney's long, documented history of automobile theft, a choice that was both a tactical necessity and a cold, procedural instrument designed to ensure his incarceration without the risks of a complex murder trial that could be undermined by the limitations of spousal testimony. Throughout the trial, Swinney remained a figure of chilling, detached composure. He sat through the testimony, the presentation of evidence regarding his criminal past, and the arguments of the prosecution with a demeanor that many observers found deeply, unnervingly indifferent. His defense team worked within the constraints of the law, challenging the admissibility of certain evidence and questioning the procedural foundations of the prosecution's case, but they could not overcome the sheer weight of his established criminal history, which allowed the state to invoke the sentencing guidelines for repeat offenders. The courtroom, while serving as a venue for justice in the eyes of the law, became a space of significant, unresolved tension. The spectators were acutely aware that the man in the dock was, in their perception, the architect of a nightmare, yet the proceedings were technically limited to the mundane, albeit illegal, acts of vehicle theft. This discrepancy between the public's understanding of his crimes and the state's official, legal pursuit created a lingering sense of dissonance that would permeate the town's memory of the case for generations to come. As the judge delivered the sentence of life imprisonment, a profound, heavy silence settled over the room, followed by the quiet, subdued ripple of movement from those who had attended the proceedings to see the end of the threat. The sentence was not a verdict on the murder charges, but its effect on the community was immediate and absolute. The incarceration of Yowl Swinney effectively served as the final, functional end of the Texarkana Moonlight murders. The period of active terror, of the nightly, self-imposed martial law, and of the paralyzing fear that had defined the town, began to slowly lift once the news of his permanent removal from society reached the public. The conviction of a man who had long been the primary focus of the authorities provided the necessary, psychological closure for a town that was, in many ways, exhausted by the weight of its own trauma. The community began the long, difficult task of reclaiming the quiet, rural spaces that had been perverted by the killer, gradually returning to the rhythm of life that had existed before the spring of 1946, even if that return would always be colored by the memory of what had been lost. The sentencing itself was a testament to the power of a legal system that, while unable to address the most heinous of the crimes, found a way to achieve a necessary, collective protection of the public. Swinney's removal from the streets was the tangible, final action in a sequence that had begun with the brutal assault on Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean Larry and ended with the miraculous, harrowing survival of Katie Starks. The impact of his incarceration on the legal system of the region was also significant, as it highlighted the complexities and the shortcomings of the existing laws regarding marital testimony and the reliance on circumstantial evidence in capital cases. These issues would continue to be discussed and debated in legal circles long after the trial had concluded, serving as a case study for future investigations into serial offenders and the inherent difficulties of the judicial process in cases where the primary evidence is entangled with personal, familial relationships. Reflecting on the courtroom proceedings, it is clear that the outcome was not the cinematic, dramatic resolution that the public might have desired, but it was a pragmatic, effective instrument of justice within the strict parameters of the law. The prosecution's ability to use the repeat offender statutes allowed them to circumvent the problematic and ultimately unsuccessful path of attempting to prove murder. This strategic, calculated decision ensured that a man they viewed as an irredeemable threat would be taken off the streets for the rest of his life, thereby preventing any further potential attacks. For the investigators who had spent thousands of hours analyzing the case, the conviction was a bittersweet, final milestone. They had not been able to definitively prove the identity of the phantom killer in a way that would satisfy the formal, historical record of the murders, but they had effectively neutralized the man they were certain was responsible. This resolution was enough for them to close their files, if not their memories, and to move on from the most intense, challenging, and psychologically taxing chapter of their professional lives. The aftermath of the sentencing was also marked by the complex, emotional, and social process of recovery for the families of the victims. For those who had lost loved ones, the end of the case did not bring an end to their grief, nor did it necessarily provide the kind of answers that would truly heal their profound loss. The trial had focused on Swinney, not on the victims, and for many, this was a difficult, painful reality to accept. The quiet, dignified persistence of the victims' families, who had lived through the most horrific, unimaginable loss, was a testament to their strength and resilience in the face of an enduring, unresolved tragedy. Their stories and the memories of the lives that had been cut short would remain a central, defining element of the Texarkana story, ensuring that the human cost of the terror would never be forgotten, even as the details of the investigation faded into the background of local history. As Swinney was transported to the prison where he would spend the rest of his life, the town of Texarkana began its slow, steady process of normalizing. The wooden planks were removed from the windows, the firearms were returned to their cases, and the quiet roads that had once been forbidden to all were slowly reclaimed by the younger generations. The fear that had once been an all-encompassing presence gradually diminished, but it never entirely vanished. The phantom killer had become a part of the town's permanent identity, an inseparable part of its history and its legend. The courtroom proceedings had provided the community with a necessary closure, but the question of whether justice had been fully served would continue to linger in the minds of those who had lived through the terror. The legal resolution of the case of Yowell Swinney was final in its impact, but it remained an incomplete story in the context of the larger mystery of the Texarkana Moonlight Murders, a mystery that would continue to be studied, analyzed, and debated for decades. The finality of his incarceration was the most significant action of the period, and it served as the definitive boundary line between the months of horror and the long process of recovery that would follow in the subsequent years of the post-war era and beyond into the late 20th century, where the legend itself would continue to evolve and find new life in the cultural imagination of the nation. The enduring legacy of the Texarkana Moonlight Murders is a testament to how deeply a single, concentrated period of violence can permanently rewrite the social and psychological landscape of an entire community. As the decades have passed since the spring of 1946, the event has transitioned from a lived, visceral reality into a cultural artifact, a cornerstone of the true crime genre, and a haunting urban legend that continues to fascinate and disturb the modern mind. The impact of these crimes was not limited to the tragic loss of the victims or the temporary terror of the residents. It extended to the very heart of American society's relationship with fear, safety, and the concept of the unknown predator. The figure of the Phantom Killer, with his crude, white burlap mask and his ability to strike at the most vulnerable moments of human intimacy, became the foundational archetype for the slasher subgenre that would later dominate the horror cinema of the 1970s and 80s. By attacking the lover's lanes, he directly targeted the symbol of American youth's burgeoning autonomy and romance, violating a space that was supposed to be safe and sacred. This, more than any other element of the case, tapped into a profound and lasting cultural anxiety regarding the fragility of the peace and privacy that the post-war era had promised. The subsequent cinematic interpretations of the events, most notably the 1976 film titled The Town That Dreaded Sundown, played a crucial role in cementing the narrative of the Texarkana murders into the collective American consciousness. These films did not merely document the crimes, they embellished, dramatized, and stylized them, turning the real-world terror of the residents of Texarkana into a fictionalized, almost mythic representation of an unstoppable, faceless killer. This adaptation process is inherently complex, as it necessitates a degree of distance from the raw, human suffering experienced by the families of the victims. For those who were there, the terror was not a cinematic device or a source of intrigue. It was a devastating reality that claimed lives and shattered futures. The persistence of these stories in popular culture speaks to a human fascination with the macabre and the unresolved, but it also underscores the ongoing, delicate tension between the preservation of historical truth and the transformation of that truth into entertainment. The victims whose lives were so violently ended were not figures in a script. They were members of a community, and their stories deserve to be remembered with a solemnity that transcends the sensationalism that often surrounds their deaths. Reflecting upon the entirety of this historical episode, one cannot help but be struck by the sheer scale of the community's response. The spontaneous, self-imposed martial law, the fortification of homes, and the complete abandonment of the public and rural spaces after dusk were not merely reactions to a series of crimes. They were manifestations of a profound collective trauma. The town of Texarkana experienced a fundamental rupture in its sense of normalcy, a breach that was not easily repaired even after the threat of the phantom was perceived to have been neutralized. The psychological scars of that spring would persist in the community, manifesting as a heightened awareness of risk and a lingering suspicion of the darkness that lay just beyond the town's boundaries. This long-term cultural impact is a defining element of the case, showing how a local incident can resonate far beyond its immediate geographic and temporal context, leaving an indelible imprint on the collective identity of those who live in its shadow. The memory of the terror became, over time, a part of the town's folklore, a story passed down through generations that served as a grim reminder of how quickly the mundane and the safe can be overtaken by the impossible and the evil. The unresolved nature of the investigation, specifically the lack of a definitive legal determination regarding the identity of the killer, continues to be a point of significant analysis for both historians and those interested in the nature of serial crime. The case of Yowell Swinney, while providing the practical end of the killings, left behind a void that has been filled by speculation and theory. This ambiguity is perhaps the most defining feature of the mystery, as it prevents the case from being neatly filed away as a solved historical event. The inability of the legal system to address the murders themselves through a formal trial means that there is no final, undisputed verdict, allowing the legend of the phantom to thrive in the gaps between the documented facts and the historical record. This unresolved status invites ongoing scrutiny and interpretation, ensuring that the Texarkana case will continue to be a subject of interest for those seeking to understand the limits of criminal investigation and the nature of institutional responses to unprecedented threats. It serves as a stark reminder that some mysteries are not designed for easy closure, and that the truth, while it may be approached, can sometimes remain perpetually just out of reach. The study of the Texarkana Moonlight murders also provides profound insights into the evolution of criminal investigation and the way that communities respond to the presence of an unknown, recurring threat. The interagency cooperation between local police, the Texas Rangers, and the federal authorities represented an early, significant attempt to centralize and coordinate the response to a serial predator, a model that would later become a standard in American law enforcement. The challenges they faced, from the limitations of early forensic science to the rigid constraints of the legal system, highlight the immense difficulty of investigating crimes that lack a clear, tangible connection to a specific, identifiable motive or individual. The story of the investigators themselves, their frustrations, their dedication, and their eventual reliance on a strategy that was only partially successful in the eyes of the law, adds a necessary, human dimension to the study of the case. They were not omniscient experts. They were people operating within the constraints of their time, fighting against a shadow that was, in many ways, beyond their capacity to fully comprehend or defeat. Ultimately, the most significant reflection to be drawn from the Texarkana Moonlight murders is the necessity of remembering the humanity of the individuals who were caught in the path of the killer. The victims were, in each case, someone's child, someone's friend, and someone's partner. Their lives were defined by the potential and the innocence of their youth, and their deaths were the ultimate negation of that potential. While the mystery of the Phantom Killer has gained an enduring, legendary status in American culture, the reality of the tragedy remains rooted in the specific, localized loss experienced by the families and the wider Texarkana community. The recognition of the human cost, is the most crucial, and often the most overlooked, element in the ongoing discussion of the case. By centering the memory of the victims, the conversation about the Phantom Killer becomes more than just an analysis of a mystery or a review of a historical event. It becomes a respectful, solemn acknowledgement of the profound impact of crime on the lives of individuals and the community as a whole. The mystery of the Phantom Killer will likely never be fully solved, and the legend will continue to grow and change, but the names of those whose lives were cut short will remain the most essential part of the story, a silent, powerful, and persistent reminder of the absolute and final human cost of the violence that once gripped the border town of Texarkana in the spring of 1946. The story is, in the end, not one of mystery but one of loss, not one of fear but one of endurance, and it is through this lens that the events are truly understood within the broader context of the history and culture of the nation and the enduring impact of the events themselves on the people who were forever changed by the arrival of the figure who chose the moonlit night to commit his deeds and who remained thereafter an unsolved echo in the annals of criminal justice and the dark history of the rural landscapes of Texas and Arkansas, like during that pivotal year that redefined the meaning of terror for the entire country and left behind a legacy of questions that will persist as long as the story itself is told and as long as the community itself continues to navigate the legacy of what was once their most terrifying experience. The physical departure of Yowell Swinney from the immediate vicinity of Texarkana to the distant, sterile confines of a state penitentiary did not instantly heal the profound wounds he, or the true phantom, had inflicted upon the souls of those who survived. For Jimmy Hollis, Mary Jean Larry, and Katie Starks, the conclusion of the legal proceedings in 1947 did not represent a clean, definitive break from the terror of 1946. Instead, it marked the beginning of a lifelong, quiet struggle to exist in a world that had been permanently, violently altered. These survivors did not have the luxury of viewing the Phantom as a historical curiosity or a cinematic icon. To them, he was a very real, physically devastating presence whose actions continued to reverberate through every day of their remaining lives. They had to wake up every morning with the physical and psychological scars of their encounters, carrying the heavy, silent burden of survival in a community that was desperately trying to forget. Jimmy Hollis, whose skull had been brutally fractured by the heavy stock of the attacker's weapon, lived his life with the physical reminders of that fateful February night. The healing of bone and tissue is a slow, imperfect process, but the healing of the mind is infinitely more complex. Hollis had to navigate the remainder of his youth and adulthood with the knowledge that he had been seconds away from death, saved only by a combination of luck and the erratic, unpredictable whims of a masked madman. The psychological trauma of being overpowered, of being forced to lie helpless on the cold ground while his companion was assaulted, was a weight that no amount of passage of time could completely lift. He had to carry the quiet, unspoken questions of what might have been, and the frustrating reality that the man who had brought him to the brink of the grave was never formally held accountable for the specific act of violence that had fractured his youth. For Mary Jean Larey, the burden was perhaps even more profound. The physical assault she endured was accompanied by a severe, lingering societal and personal trauma that was characteristic of the era in which she lived. In 1946, the public discussion of sexual violence was wrapped in a suffocating layer of shame, silence, and social stigma. Mary Jean had to carry the memory of her terrifying ordeal without the benefit of the modern, comprehensive psychological support systems that exist today. Her survival was a testament to her extraordinary strength, but the cost of that survival was an enduring, quiet isolation. She had to rebuild her life in the shadow of a community that, while sympathetic, often preferred to avoid the uncomfortable, raw reality of the violence she had experienced. The faceless man in the white burlap mask remained a constant, silent visitor in her thoughts, an unresolved presence that defied the neat, tidy endings that the town's leaders so desperately sought to project. Katie Starks, too, carried the physical and emotional devastation of the attack on her farmhouse for the rest of her days. The 2 gunshot wounds to her face had left permanent physical markers of the night her husband, Virgil, was stolen from her. Every time she looked in a mirror, she was confronted with the physical signature of the phantom's malice. The loss of her husband in their own home, a space that was supposed to represent the ultimate sanctuary of their shared life, was a grief that could not be easily reconciled. Katie's miraculous survival and her brave run through the dark night to find help became a legendary story of resilience. But behind the legend was a woman who had to live with the quiet, empty spaces in her home and the persistent, gnawing awareness of how fragile life truly is. The farmhouse, once a place of warmth and agriculture, was permanently transformed into a site of historical tragedy, a physical monument to the night the boundary between safety and terror was shattered. From the perspective of modern criminology, the Texarkana Moonlight Murders represent a critical, transitional moment in the history of serial violence in America. In 1946, the term serial killer did not exist in the common lexicon, nor did the sophisticated, psychological profiling techniques that are now standard in the investigation of repetitive, predatory crimes. The investigators of the era, despite their dedication and their formidable resources, were operating without the benefit of decades of accumulated knowledge regarding the behavioral patterns, the fantasy-driven motives, and the escalation cycles of serial offenders. They viewed the crimes through the traditional lenses of motive, opportunity, and localized criminality, struggling to comprehend an offender whose primary motivation was not financial gain, personal vengeance, or domestic dispute, but rather a deeply ingrained, sadistic desire for control, destruction, and terror. This lack of scientific understanding made the task of identifying the elusive killer nearly impossible, as they were searching for a traditional criminal when they were actually dealing with a completely different kind of monster. If the phantom killer were to strike today, the investigative response would be radically different, utilizing an array of technological and behavioral tools that were completely unimaginable to the Texas Rangers and the FBI agents of 1946. Modern forensic science, with its ability to extract and analyze minute traces of DNA, would have subjected the crime scenes to an entirely different level of scrutiny. The blood-stained shirt found in Swinney's possession, the physical evidence left behind in the vehicles of Richard Griffin and Polly and Moore, and the biological traces at the site of Betty Jo Booker's tragic assault would have been analyzed with a precision that could have definitively established a link between the suspect and the victims. The reliance on the problematic, legally vulnerable testimony of a spouse would have been greatly reduced, as the silent, objective testimony of forensic evidence would have spoken with a clarity that no legal technicality could easily silence. The physical space of Texarkana itself has continued to evolve, slowly absorbing the memory of the murders into its physical and cultural geography. The quiet, rural dirt roads that once served as the lovers' lanes have, in many cases, been paved over, integrated into the expanding suburban grid of a growing community. The dense woods that once provided the Phantom with his protective cover have been partially cleared, replaced by homes, schools, and businesses that show no outward sign of the terror that once transpired on their ground. Yet, for those who know the history, the geography of the town remains haunted by the events of 1946. A drive down Richard Road or a visit to the rural outskirts of the city is still accompanied by a quiet, lingering awareness of the tragedy, a sense that the past is never truly gone, but merely buried beneath the thin veneer of modern progress. This relationship with its own history is perhaps most clearly demonstrated by the town's complex, ongoing interaction with the film The Town That Dreaded Sundown. For decades, the movie was screened annually in the local area, an event that drew crowds of both locals and visitors who were eager to experience the chill of the legend in the very place where it occurred. This annual ritual represents a unique form of collective processing, a way for the community to confront its most famous tragedy through the safe, structured medium of cinema. It is a moment where the real-world grief of 1946 is temporarily transformed into a shared cultural experience, allowing the town to claim ownership of a narrative that once threatened to tear it apart. Yet, the screening also serves as a reminder of the permanent, irreversible change that the Phantom brought to Texarkana, a change that transformed a quiet border town into a permanent symbol of small-town vulnerability and American Gothic terror. In the final analysis, the true terror of the Phantom Killer lies not merely in the physical violence he inflicted, but in the complete, enduring anonymity that he maintained. By never being officially identified, by never having his face revealed to the public in a court of law, he escaped the humanizing, reducing process that typically accompanies the capture and conviction of a criminal. A captured killer is eventually understood as a mortal man, a flawed, often pathetic individual whose motivations can be analyzed, whose weaknesses can be exposed, and whose threat can be definitively neutralized. But an unidentified killer remains a myth, a shapeless, immortal entity that exists outside the boundaries of time and mortality. The white burlap mask did not just hide his face in 1946. It preserved him in a state of permanent, terrifying potential, ensuring that he would always exist in the cultural imagination as the pure, unadulterated embodiment of the stranger in the dark. Ultimately, the story of Texarkana is a reminder of the fragile boundary between safety and terror. It asks us to look out into the quiet night and recognize that some shadows never fully disappear. While the real-world case remains forever cold, the memory of those lost lives on, serving as a solemn testament to a community that endured, survived, and rebuilt itself in the wake of an unimaginable darkness that once claimed the moonlight of their own peaceful home. The names of the victims remain the true heart of this narrative, a silent, powerful, and persistent reminder of the absolute human cost of the violence that once entirely shattered their peaceful world. The passage of time often acts as a slow, rhythmic tide, washing away the sharp edges of trauma and smoothing the jagged memories of the past until they become mere pebbles in the collective stream of history. Yet, for the community of Texarkana, the events of 1946 remain a granite boulder, immovable and stark, sitting firmly in the center of its identity. As we look back from the vantage point of the 21st century, we see that the story of the Phantom Killer has evolved into something far greater than a mere local crime file. It has become a foundational American myth, a cautionary tale whispered to every new generation that moves into the quiet, tree-lined suburbs of the border region. The legend serves as a permanent, pulsing heartbeat beneath the town's modern facade, reminding everyone that the veneer of civilization is thinner than we would like to believe, and that the silence of a moonlit night is not always the silence of peace, but sometimes the silence of a predator holding its breath. The enduring nature of this mystery lies in its frustrating, elegant incompleteness. It refuses to provide the comfort of a resolution, compelling us to return to the details, to the names of the victims, and to the unanswered questions again and again, as if by staring long enough at the void, we might finally discern a face behind the burlap mask. This fascination is not merely morbid, it is deeply, profoundly human. We gravitate toward the story of Texarkana because it speaks to the fundamental vulnerability of our existence. The victims were, in many respects, us. They were young people enjoying the freedom of their youth, seeking the sanctity of private conversation away from the rigid structures of their homes, unaware that their simple, innocent actions had placed them in the crosshairs of an inexplicable, random violence. When we read their stories, we do not see historical figures. We see reflections of our own desires for autonomy, our own moments of quiet intimacy, and our own inherent fragility in the face of a chaotic and often indifferent world. Their tragic end, coming at a time when the world was supposed to be transitioning toward a bright, post-war future, creates a sharp dissonance that heightens the emotional impact of the tragedy. They represent a lost potential, a collection of futures that were abruptly, violently erased by an act of absolute malice that had no discernible reason, no clear motive, and no satisfying explanation. The figure of the Phantom Killer, by contrast, has been stripped of all humanity in the historical record, becoming a pure vessel for the dark impulses that society finds most terrifying. He is the embodiment of the stranger who walks among us unnoticed, the person who knows our routines, observes our sanctuaries, and waits for the perfect, vulnerable moment to strike. This, ultimately, is the source of his enduring power as an archetype. He does not need a name, a motive, or a background because he represents the abstract concept of evil itself, the force that comes from the outside to destroy the stability we have built within. By remaining unidentified, he achieves a strange, dark immortality, unburdened by the mundane details of a human life that would inevitably reduce his stature. He will always be the tall, hulking figure in the white sack, standing at the edge of the woods, forever poised to emerge from the darkness, a reminder that the world is not always as safe as it seems, and that there are mysteries that will never be untangled. Moreover, the story of Texarkana serves as a poignant, historical study of the evolution of the American community in the mid-20th century. It reflects the post-war shift in how people lived, how they interacted with their environments, and how they began to define their relationship with crime and safety. The reaction of the residents, the rapid, spontaneous implementation of a self-imposed martial law, is a powerful illustration of the democratic impulse towards self-preservation in the face of an existential threat. It shows us that when the mechanisms of the state, despite their best efforts, falter in the face of an unprecedented crisis, the community itself becomes the primary agent of its own protection. This, the internal, collaborative response of the citizens, is as much a part of the Texarkana story as the crimes themselves, and it provides a counter-narrative to the despair of the murders, highlighting the resilience, the unity, and the shared commitment to survival that defines the character of the town, even under the most extreme, unimaginable conditions. As the years continue to accumulate, the narrative of the Moonlight Murders will likely continue to shift, as each generation interprets the events through the lens of its own experiences and anxieties. What was a terrifying, immediate reality for the residents of 1946 has become a narrative that is increasingly detached from the human tragedy and more firmly embedded in the realm of cultural memory. This is the inevitable fate of all such historical events, yet there remains a solemn responsibility to ensure that the human element is not entirely lost in the process of mythologizing. The victims, Jimmy, Mary Jean, Richard, Polly and Paul, Betty Jo, Virgil and Katie, must remain the focal point of the story, for their lives were the currency with which the Phantom paid for his entry into legend. Their experiences, their suffering, and their survival must be the primary metric by which we assess the significance of the case, ensuring that the study of the mystery never descends into a celebration of the violence that created it. In reflecting on this long, complex saga, one is struck by the quiet, enduring grace of those who survived. Their lives, moving forward despite the shadow of what they had endured, demonstrate the capacity of the human spirit to transcend even the most profound, traumatic ruptures. They did not allow the Phantom to define their total existence. They continued to grow, to work, to love, and to participate in the life of their community, even as they carried the weight of a memory that no one else could fully share. Their persistence is a quieter, less sensational, but far more important part of the story than the killer's actions. It is a testament to the strength that can exist in the wake of tragedy, a strength that is perhaps the only genuine answer to the darkness that the Phantom brought to the lovers' lanes. Their lives are the real, concrete history of Texarkana, a history that is defined by the ability to keep going, even when the night has been at its most terrifying. Ultimately, the Texarkana Moonlight Murders stand as a silent, powerful monument to the reality that some questions in life do not possess clear, satisfactory answers. We seek closure because it allows us to feel that we have mastered our environment, that we have identified the root causes of our fears, and that we have successfully categorized and contained the threats that lurk in the dark. But the story of the Phantom reminds us that the world is inherently, sometimes cruelly, unpredictable. It reminds us that there are forces and individuals whose motivations remain hidden, whose actions defy our desire for logic, and whose legacy persists in a state of eternal, unresolved tension. We are left, then, with the mystery itself, a persistent, haunting echo that calls out from the mid-century, challenging us to contemplate the nature of evil, the necessity of community, and the fragile, precious nature of the lives that are caught in the wake of the unknown. The story of Texarkana is not just about a series of murders. It is about the experience of facing the impossible and the enduring, fundamental drive of the human spirit to find meaning, to find safety, and to find a way to live when the moonlight has revealed, all too briefly and all too devastatingly, the darkness that can dwell within the hearts of men, and the quiet, persistent, unyielding light of those who choose, in the aftermath, to continue to thrive and to remember, ensuring that the legacy of their town is not just one of tragedy, but one of profound, lasting resilience in the face of an enigma that will remain, for all time, the greatest, most haunting, and most enduring mystery in the modern history of the American borderlands that was once forever altered by the arrival of the man who walked in the moonlight and left behind a story that will never truly fade away from the hearts and minds of those who seek to understand the deep and sometimes terrifying mysteries of the human condition itself as the years turn into decades and the mystery itself remains an active participant in the cultural life of the region and the nation at large through the retelling of the tale that defines the town of Texarkana in the light of the past. The finality of the Texarkana story is an illusion, a comforting narrative construct that we impose upon a set of events that are, in truth, fundamentally resistant to such neatness. As we bring this exploration to its conclusion, we find that the mystery of the Phantom Killer does not reach a destination. It simply fades into the backdrop of the American experience, becoming a permanent fixture of our shared cultural landscape. The process of analyzing these crimes, of dissecting the terror of the spring of 1946, is in itself a reflective act, a way for us to revisit the foundational anxieties that continue to inform our understanding of safety and human depravity. We have traced the sequence of the attacks, the desperate scramble of the authorities, the trial of a man who served as a proxy for our collective fears, and the long, slow process of recovery for the victims and the community. Yet, despite this comprehensive examination, the core of the mystery, the identity of the man behind the burlap mask, remains as elusive and enigmatic as it was on those quiet, rural nights 7 decades ago. This enduring ambiguity is the source of the story's power. It challenges the inherent desire for justice that defines the modern judicial mind, asking us to confront the possibility that some actions may never be fully reconciled with the law. The case of Texarkana serves as a powerful, somber lesson in the limits of investigation and the persistence of the unknown. It reminds us that even when the machinery of the state is applied with maximum intensity, and even when a community unites in a singular, desperate effort to protect itself, there are circumstances where the truth remains hidden, shielded by the very chaos and unpredictability that characterize the act of violence itself. The mystery is not a failure of intelligence or effort. It is a fundamental characteristic of a world where individuals can act in ways that are entirely outside the bounds of human understanding, leaving behind nothing but the wreckage of their presence and the silence of their departure. As the legend of the Phantom continues to grow, it reflects the evolving nature of our own cultural relationship with the concept of the predator. We have moved from the shock of the immediate post-war era to a modern landscape where the imagery of the slasher has become a staple of popular entertainment, yet the chilling, visceral terror of the original Texarkana events retains a unique, haunting quality that distinguishes it from the fictionalized versions that followed. This is because the terror in Texarkana was not scripted, it was lived, and it was suffered. The real-world impact of the murders on the lives of those involved, on their families, and on the fundamental day-to-day rhythm of their community, provides an emotional gravity that no cinematic interpretation can fully replicate. When we remember the victims, we are not engaging with an archetype. We are engaging with the memory of people who had lives that were, in their own right, as rich, complex, and full of potential as our own. The act of remembering is, therefore, a moral responsibility, a way to ensure that the sensationalism of the legend does not entirely obscure the reality of the loss. Furthermore, The story of Texarkana serves as an essential case study in the architecture of fear. By examining how the residents organized themselves, how they redefined their social lives, and how they adapted to an environment where the darkness was no longer merely the absence of light, but the presence of a threat, we gain a deeper appreciation for the psychological resilience that is required when a community is pushed to its absolute limits. The self-imposed martial law was an extraordinary collective action, a moment where the norms of town life were suspended in favor of survival. This period of intense, shared struggle reveals the hidden strengths of the citizenry, the ways in which neighbors relied upon one another, the ways in which the town maintained its structure even as its sense of safety disintegrated, and the ways in which the memory of the ordeal became a shared, binding experience that informed the subsequent history of the region. In the final assessment, the Texarkana Moonlight Murders stand as a silent, powerful monument to the reality that life is inherently unpredictable and that safety is a fragile, conditional state. The story reminds us that we are all, to some extent, inhabitants of a landscape that is defined by the tension between the light of our everyday lives and the dark, unexplored corners of the world that exist around us. We build our homes, we lock our doors, and we cherish our routines because they provide us with a sense of control over an existence that is otherwise entirely beyond our mastery. The Phantom Killer, in his anonymity and his calculated cruelty, represents the disruption of this control, a force that invades the space of our most cherished innocence and forces us to confront the terrifying reality of our vulnerability. Yet, the story does not end in despair. It ends in the enduring, persistent light of those who moved forward, who rebuilt, and who ensured that their community was defined by more than just the violence that once visited it. The legacy of the Phantom is thus a complex, multifaceted one, encompassing both the darkness of his deeds and the light of the town's response. It is a story that refuses to be forgotten, a narrative that is continuously re-examined, retold, and re-evaluated by each subsequent generation. As we set aside these chronicles, we are left with the awareness that the mystery of Texarkana will persist long after we are gone, an unsolved, haunting melody in the long, complex history of the American experience. It is a mystery that requires no resolution to retain its significance, for its significance lies not in the identity of the culprit, but in the enduring, human response to an impossible and devastating event. The final word on the matter is not to be found in the yellowed pages of a crime file or in the archives of a state prison, but in the collective memory of a town that survived its greatest trial and chose, in the face of an enigma, to remain a community that defines itself not by its fear, but by its capacity to endure, to grow, and to remember. The moonlight over the rural outskirts of Texarkana may look the same as it did in the spring of 1946, but for those who know the history, the shadows have a different depth, the silence a different weight, and the memory a different, profound, and lingering resonance that speaks to the heart of what it means to live, to suffer, and to find the strength to carry on in a world that is, in its deepest, most hidden corners, forever haunted by the specter of the unknown and the silent. Unresolved questions that will remain, for the duration of the future, a testament to the night the Phantom walked the roads and left the world in a state of eternal, unresolved and haunting mystery that will forever serve as the most enduring and most haunting reminder of the fragile and fleeting nature of our own safety in the modern world that we all inhabit and that we must always recognize as the most sacred and yet the most vulnerable aspect of our human experience as we continue to seek the light in the darkness of a history that refuses to be fully illuminated, and that leaves us with the quiet and persistent reminder of the lives that were lost and the town that was changed forever in the spring of that pivotal year that redefined the very concept of terror for the entire nation and established the legend of the man in the white burlap mask as a permanent part of the fabric of the American soul and the ongoing dialogue about the dark corners of the human condition that will continue as long as we tell the stories of who we are and where we have been in the long and complex journey through the history of our time. As the narrative of the Texarkana Moonlight Murders draws to a final, contemplative close, we must acknowledge that our collective obsession with the Phantom Killer is not truly about the man behind the white burlap mask, but about the boundaries of our own perception. For 10 agonizing weeks, the town of Texarkana was forced to act as the crucible for the deepest, most primordial fears of the 20th century. The events of 1946 were not merely an outbreak of criminal violence. They were a systemic violation of the social contract, a ruthless dismantling of the assumption that our homes, our cars, and our quietest moments are shielded from the intrusion of chaos. By engaging with this history, we are essentially revisiting the birth of a certain type of modern anxiety, the realization that the safety we construct is a fragile, conditional state, and that the person who threatens that safety may be someone who walks past us on the street, someone who remains entirely invisible until the moment they decide to strike. The legacy of the Phantom is also a story about the limitations of our institutions. When the police, the Texas Rangers, and the FBI converged on that small border town, they brought with them the total force of federal and state authority. They followed every lead, they implemented tactical traps, and they utilized the most sophisticated investigative methods available at the time. Yet, despite this comprehensive commitment of resources, the Phantom remained untethered to the law. He remained a shadow, a presence that could not be pinned down by the static reality of a courtroom or the rigid structure of a prosecution. This is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the entire affair, the acknowledgement that despite our best intentions and our most organized systems of justice, there remain forces in the world that operate entirely outside of our control, leaving behind nothing but the cold, hard evidence of their passage. When we consider the victims, we see the true cost of this mystery. The lives of Jimmy Hollis, Mary Jean Larry, Richard Griffin, Polly and Moore, Paul Martin, Betty Jo Booker, Virgil Starks, and the wounded survivor Katie Starks were not just data points in an unsolved case file. They were individuals whose futures were violently, prematurely extinguished. Their stories deserve to be told not as a means to enhance the allure of a legend, but as a way to honor the humanity that was taken from them. The loss they suffered is the only truth that matters in this narrative, and it is the only truth that is not obscured by the passage of time or the embellishments of film. Their memory serves as a constant, sobering tether, preventing our investigation of the case from spiraling into a mere exercise in theoretical speculation or the consumption of entertainment. Furthermore, we must recognize that the community of Texarkana did not simply succumb to the terror. It endured, adapted, and ultimately reclaimed its identity. The self-imposed martial law was an act of profound social agency. In a world that often emphasizes the helplessness of victims in the face of violence, the residents of Texarkana demonstrated that a community possesses its own internal mechanisms for survival, protection, and collective healing. They locked their doors and they held their ground, refusing to allow the Phantom to permanently dismantle the social fabric of their town. This resilience is the true, lasting answer to the violence of 1946. It is a testament to the fact that while a predator can claim a life, they cannot claim the spirit of a community that is committed to the protection of its own and the preservation of its collective dignity. As we look toward the future, the story of the Phantom will continue to be debated, analyzed, and reimagined, but its core will always remain a dark, unresolved puzzle that sits on the periphery of our consciousness. We will continue to ask the same questions, not because we expect new answers to emerge from the archives, but because the act of asking is how we grapple with the nature of the unknown. We are drawn to the mystery because it mirrors the complexities and the uncertainties of our own existence. We want to believe that there is a clear distinction between the safe and the dangerous, the known and the unknown, the light and the dark, but the story of Texarkana consistently blurs these lines, forcing us to recognize that they are not as distinct as we would like them to be. The study of this mystery also invites us to consider the ways in which our perceptions of crime are influenced by the era in which we live. The Phantom of 1946 would be perceived very differently if he were to appear in our contemporary landscape, where our constant digital interconnectedness creates a radically different environment for the perpetrator and the protector alike. The isolation that once defined the lovers' lanes of Texarkana is a luxury that has largely vanished in a world of ubiquitous connectivity, yet the underlying fear of the unknown predator remains a constant element of the human experience. We have traded one set of vulnerabilities for another, but the essential, existential unease that the Phantom tapped into remains as potent today as it was in the post-war era. In the final, enduring reflection, we must accept that the mystery of the Phantom Killer is not a riddle to be solved, but an experience to be processed. It is a part of our shared cultural memory, a reminder of the darkness that can exist within the human heart and the resilience that can be found within the human community. As the legend of the burlap mask continues to evolve, It carries with it the echoes of the victims and the silence of the woods where they were taken. It remains a testament to the night the moonlight was stolen by a monster, and a tribute to the people who found the light again, piece by piece, as they navigated the path toward recovery and healing. The mystery remains, a quiet, persistent, and unyielding echo of the past, waiting in the darkness for the next generation to wonder about the identity of the man who left such a deep and permanent mark on the history of the borderlands, and who will continue, for as long as we tell this tale, to represent the most enduring mystery of the mid-20th century, a haunting shadow that, while never brought to the light of truth, is nonetheless remembered, contemplated, and honored through the ongoing, respectful acknowledgement of the lives that were, in the most profound and permanent sense, changed by the arrival of the unknown and the enduring impact of the events that forever altered the course of the town of Texarkana in the spring of that pivotal year that would come to define the terror for the entire country and leave behind a legacy of questions that will persist as long as the story itself is told and as long as the community itself continues to navigate the legacy of what was once their most terrifying experience in the modern history of the American borderlands that was once forever altered by the arrival of the man who walked in the moonlight and left behind a story that will never truly fade away from the hearts and minds of those who seek to understand the deep and sometimes terrifying mysteries of the human condition itself as the years turn into decades and the mystery itself remains an active participant in the cultural life of the region and the nation at large through the retelling of the tale that defines the town of Texarkana in the light of the past and the shadow of a future that will always hold the memory of the phantom within its own dark and silent embrace until the end of our own time. As we move past the definitive chronological account of the Texarkana moonlight murders and consider the broader implications of this enduring mystery, we are compelled to address the nature of storytelling itself in the context of true crime. The transition from a series of brutal, horrific acts to a fixed point in the American cultural imagination is not an accidental process. It is a slow, methodical refinement that strips away the messy, chaotic, and often contradictory details of reality to produce a narrative that is coherent, compelling, and ultimately consumable. When we recount the terror of the spring of 1946, we are engaged in an act of historical construction, shaping the raw, bleeding edges of human tragedy into a form that can be studied, debated, and even memorialized. Yet, in this process of shaping, we face a recurring, ethical challenge. How do we maintain a sincere, unwavering focus on the dignity of the victims while satisfying the inherent human urge to explore the depths of the mystery they were tragically caught within? The answer, if one exists, lies in the deliberate, consistent centering of the human experience over the spectacle of the unknown. We must resist the gravitational pull of the phantom's anonymity, which invites us to treat his existence as a puzzle to be solved rather than a source of infinite pain. By constantly returning to the names of Jimmy, Mary Jean, Richard, Polly and Paul, Betty Jo, Virgil and Katie, we anchor the narrative in the reality of lives that were interrupted. We remind ourselves that the burlap-masked figure was not a literary device created to haunt the midnight screenings of a small town, but a person, or perhaps a collection of persons, who chose to inflict profound, irreparable damage on others. The focus on the victims is the only way to counteract the dehumanizing effect of the slasher archetype that has been constructed around these events over the decades. It is a necessary, corrective measure that honors the truth of their loss above all else. This exploration also highlights the inherent vulnerability of the small-town identity in the face of external, unpredictable violence. Texarkana, like countless other communities across the vast, diverse landscape of the United States, was defined by a perceived safety that was fundamentally tied to the reliability of its social order. The arrival of the phantom did not just disrupt this order, it dismantled it, forcing the residents to confront the reality that the safety they enjoyed was always a matter of perspective. This realization, while devastating, led to a unique communal transformation. The adoption of a self-imposed martial law was not merely a reaction, it was an act of assertion. By reclaiming their evenings, by fortifying their windows, and by standing guard against the encroaching darkness, the people of Texarkana asserted their right to control their own environment. This response remains one of the most compelling aspects of the entire mystery, offering a portrait of a society that, when challenged by the most extreme circumstances, was capable of an organized, steadfast commitment to the preservation of its own internal peace. The mystery of the Phantom's identity, while remaining perpetually unresolved, serves as an essential mirror for our own societal anxieties. We are naturally suspicious of the unknown, and we are fundamentally uncomfortable with the existence of events that lack a clear, logical explanation. The Texarkana case provides a space for these fears to be projected and examined. We create theories, we analyze evidence, and we speculate about the nature of the killer because we want to believe that there is a rational framework to human behavior, even in its most aberrant forms. The fact that we cannot reach a definitive conclusion is the true, lingering lesson of the case. It teaches us that the world is not always governed by the rules we hope to impose upon it, and that some events exist outside the boundaries of our ability to categorize or contain them. We must learn to live with the discomfort of this ambiguity, recognizing that it is an inherent part of the human journey. Looking back at the trajectory of the last 70 years, we see that the Texarkana case has become something of a perennial touchstone for the study of serial crime. It was an early, pivotal example of how a series of seemingly disparate, localized attacks could trigger a nationwide psychological response. It showed the world that a small, geographically isolated area could become the center of a profound, national nightmare if the threat was sufficiently terrifying and the culprit sufficiently elusive. The coordination between the local authorities, the Texas Rangers, and the FBI was a precursor to the specialized, interagency cooperation that is now a fundamental component of criminal investigation. In this way, the failures of the Texarkana investigation were just as instructive as the successes of later, more sophisticated efforts. They exposed the systemic limitations of a legal and investigative framework that was not yet prepared to handle the unique, predatory psychology of a serial killer. Furthermore, we must reflect on the role of the media in shaping the legacy of these crimes. The reporting in the aftermath of the murders was a mixture of sober, factual investigation and the sensationalism that has always accompanied the coverage of violent, unsolved mysteries. The interplay between the objective reality of the crimes and the subjective interpretation provided by the press, played an instrumental role in the creation of the Phantom's legend. By highlighting the more terrifying, dramatic elements of the attacks, the burlap mask, the moonlit setting, the choice of the lovers' lanes, the media effectively authored the myth of the Phantom, giving him a stature that extended far beyond the reality of his actions. This process of legend building is a common, often inevitable feature of such cases, but it serves as a reminder that the way we tell the story of a crime is just as important as the crime itself, as it influences how we remember the victims and how we conceive of the threat that the killer poses to our society. In the final, ultimate contemplation of this saga, we are left with the silence of the rural woods, the memory of the victims, and the enduring enigma of the man who left their lives in ruins. The mystery will never be finished, for it is constantly being rewritten and reevaluated by every new individual who encounters the story. It is a story that requires no definitive answer to retain its relevance, for its purpose is not to provide facts but to provoke thought. It invites us to examine the thin, fragile lines that separate our safety from our fear, our reality from our imagination, and our history from our myth. The story of Texarkana is, and will remain, an essential part of the tapestry of American true crime, a tale that captures the imagination not because it is solved, but because it challenges us to look deeper into the shadows and acknowledge that we may never fully understand the darkness that resides within the human heart. As we conclude this long, multi-part examination of the Texarkana Moonlight murders, we do so with a profound, solemn respect for the lives that were so abruptly, violently interrupted by the violence of the spring of 1946. We have sought to honor their memory by maintaining a focus on the humanity they represented, ensuring that the legacy of their town is recognized as one of profound resilience in the face of an impossible, unrelenting, and ultimately unanswerable evil. The story of the Phantom will continue, a persistent, haunting presence in the annals of our history, a mystery that, for as long as we continue to care about the nature of our safety and the memory of the victims, will persist, a testament to the night the moonlight was forever shadowed by the arrival of an unknown, a presence that will remain, for all time, the greatest, most haunting, and most enduring mystery in the history of the modern American experience, that will remain forever etched into the landscape of the borderlands where the terror was born, and where the memory of those who lived through it will always endure, as a quiet, persistent, unyielding light against the deep, dark shadows of the past, that we must remember, that we must reflect upon, and that we must ultimately hold in our collective consciousness as a reminder of the fragility of our existence, the importance of our community, and the enduring and the powerful and the necessary and the solemn duty to remember the victims of Texarkana and to hold their memory sacred even as we continue to wonder about the truth that will forever remain locked in the silence of the night that we can never fully know and that we must always carry with us into the future of our own time and beyond as the story itself remains an active part of our ongoing efforts to understand the deep and complex reality of the world we all share and the mystery of the phantom who left us with only questions that will persist as long as the story of their town continues to be told throughout the ages to come and beyond our own brief and fleeting lives in this vast and often dark and mysterious world that we inhabit together in the light of the moon that shines above us, all the same in the silent and eternal night that never truly ends for those who seek to understand the true and the dark history of the world we all call our home.